The story of Hungary begins long before a Hungarian state existed, long before the first crowned kings, and even long before the Magyars themselves reached the heart of Central Europe. To understand how a distinct Hungarian identity eventually took shape, we first have to explore the deeper history of the Carpathian Basin and the early development of the Magyar people. This landscape, ringed by mountains and crossed by rivers like the Danube and the Tisa, was not empty land waiting for newcomers. It was a crossroads, repeatedly shaped by waves of human migration, conquest, and cultural blending over thousands of years. Archaeology reveals that people lived in the Carpathian Basin as far back as the Paleolithic period, but its first historically recorded inhabitants were Celtic groups during the first millennium BCE. These Celtic communities created fortified settlements and produced metalwork that shows sophisticated craftsmanship. By the 1st century BCE, however, Roman expansion reached into this region. The Romans established the province of Pannonia, introducing roads, military fortifications, and new administrative systems. Towns like Aquincum, near modern Budapest, grew into important centers of trade and governance. Yet Roman power was not eternal. Beginning in the 4th century CE, migrations from the east gradually pushed Germanic peoples such as the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards into the Carpathian Basin. These groups did not remain permanently, but their movements illustrate how this area served as a gateway between Europe and the Eurasian steppe. By the late 6th century, a new power took shape: the Avar Khaganate. The Avars were a nomadic people with steppe traditions, likely arriving from regions far to the east. They built a strong political structure and dominated much of the Carpathian Basin for more than 2 centuries. Their presence introduced new military and cultural influences, including mounted warfare and certain burial customs found across the region. But by the early 9th century, the Avar state weakened under pressure from Frankish military campaigns led by Charlemagne and internal fragmentation. As the Avar order collapsed, Slavic-speaking communities expanded, farming the land and building small settlements. These Slavic groups would later become important neighbors and sometimes rivals of the Hungarians. While the Carpathian Basin underwent these transformations, the ancestors of the Magyars were living far to the east, on the vast expanses of the Eurasian steppe. Linguistic evidence places the early Magyar people within the Uralic language family, related to Finnish and Estonian. Their distant origins lie near the Ural Mountains, where early Ugric-speaking groups practiced herding, hunting, and seasonal movement. Over many generations, these communities gradually shifted southward and westward, interacting with Iranian, Turkic, and other nomadic peoples. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the Magyars formed a distinct tribal alliance, often referred to as the Magyar Confederation. They lived in the region known as Etelköz, located between the Dnieper and lower Danube rivers. Etelköz provided a strategic position along major trade routes, and the Magyars became known for their mobility, mounted archery, and ability to form shifting alliances. Their society combined pastoralism with early forms of agriculture, and political leadership was shared among several tribal heads. 2 positions became especially important: the Kende, a spiritual or ceremonial leader, and the Gyula, a military commander. Over time, the role of the military leader grew stronger, and within this evolving political landscape, the figure of Almos emerged. Almos, remembered by later Hungarian tradition as a founding leader, played a central role in unifying the tribes. Although historical details about him are limited, sources describe him as part of the line that would later produce Arpad, the leader who guided the Magyars into the Carpathian Basin. The rise of Almos and Arpad reflects a broader transformation. The Magyars were moving from a loose tribal network toward a more centralized and coordinated leadership. Their military strength and cohesion made them valuable allies in the complex geopolitics of Eastern Europe. In the 9th century, the Magyars interacted extensively with the Byzantine Empire, the Khazar Khaganate, and the emerging powers of the Eastern Slavs. Their alliances frequently shifted, often based on opportunities for trade, military support, or survival. Byzantine records describe them as formidable warriors whose mounted archers could strike quickly and vanish just as suddenly. Their mobility, a key feature of steppe warfare, allowed them to raid far into enemy territory, but it also exposed them to counterattacks from stronger states. A major turning point came when the Magyars became involved in conflicts between the Bulgarian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, seeking allies against Bulgaria, encouraged the Magyars to attack from the north. The campaign achieved short-term goals, but it also provoked a strong Bulgarian response. Under the leadership of Tsar Simeon, the Bulgarians struck back and inflicted heavy losses on the Magyars in Etelköz. This defeat destabilized their position and made their homeland vulnerable to the Pechenegs, another powerful steppe people. Facing pressure from both south and east, the Magyars began searching for new territory. The Carpathian Basin, which had been home to so many successive peoples, now offered an appealing refuge. It had fertile land for pastoralists and farmers, natural defenses created by surrounding mountains, and sparse political control following the decline of the Avars and the retreat of the Carolingians. Slavic communities lived throughout the region, and the First Bulgarian Empire influenced parts of the southern basin. But there was no dominant force that could prevent a new migration. When the Magyars entered the Carpathian Basin at the end of the 9th century, they were not merely fleeing danger from the east. They were stepping into a landscape that held the possibility of long-term settlement and political transformation. This period, remembered in Hungarian history as the foundation of their homeland, marked a decisive turning point. It reshaped the Magyars from a mobile tribal alliance into a people laying the groundwork for a future kingdom. The story of this transition is one of adaptation, conflict, and the gradual emergence of a new political order. The migration led by Arpad carried the Magyars through the passes of the Carpathians and onto the great Hungarian plain. This immense stretch of open land had long attracted steppe peoples with its broad pastures and river networks. Here, the Magyars could practice the pastoral traditions that had sustained them for centuries. Their herds of horses were central to their way of life, both economically and culturally, and the plains of the basin offered space to rebuild and expand after the difficulties they faced in Etelköz. Yet settlement alone was not enough. The Magyars needed security, and achieving that meant confronting the shifting political forces of Central Europe. Several neighboring powers were uneasy as they watched the Magyar presence grow. To the west, the East Frankish Kingdom remained a major force, although its internal divisions weakened its response to the newcomers. To the south, the First Bulgarian Empire still held significant influence. To the north, various Slavic groups lived in loose principalities, each reacting differently to Magyar expansion. The Magyars quickly understood that establishing themselves in this region required not only military strength, but also strategic diplomacy. Under Arpad's leadership, the tribal confederation maintained a military organization centered on speed and precision. Their cavalry, trained from childhood to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, was one of the most effective strike forces in Europe. This capability allowed the Magyars to defend their new homeland and to project power far beyond it. As they consolidated their presence inside the Carpathian Basin, they also began launching raids into surrounding territories. These raids became a defining feature of Magyar military activity during the 10th century. The raids were not mere acts of plunder. They served political and economic purposes. Through swift and targeted strikes, the Magyars discouraged neighboring states from attacking them. At the same time, the wealth gained through these campaigns supported the Confederation, ensured loyalty among the tribes, and funded the development of settlements and fortifications within the basin. Their campaigns reached deep into Central and Western Europe, touching regions as distant as modern Germany, Switzerland, northern Italy, and even the edges of the Iberian Peninsula. European chronicles of the time describe Magyar armies appearing suddenly, devastating entire regions, and disappearing before defenders could gather. But this pattern also created long-term challenges. While the raids strengthened the Magyars in the short term, they increasingly alarmed the rulers of Western Europe. Among them was the East Frankish king, who would later be known as Otto I. His efforts to rebuild a strong, unified state directly clashed with the threat posed by Magyar incursions. As the 10th century advanced, the balance of power began to shift. The Magyars could not rely forever on mobility and speed. European armies were learning from their defeats, adopting new tactics and fortifications. Inside the Carpathian Basin, meanwhile, the Magyars were undergoing their own transformation. Extended settlement encouraged changes in social structure. While traditional clan loyalties remained strong, the need for more coordinated leadership increased. Before migration, military authority often rested with the tribal chieftains. But now, long-term defense of territory required stronger, centralized direction. Unifying a people who had operated for generations through kinship networks was not a simple task. Yet the pressures of settlement and external threats pushed them steadily toward political evolution. Arpad's lineage maintained a central role in this unfolding process. Although direct documentation from the time is limited, later Hungarian tradition credits Arpad with unifying the tribal chiefs and guiding the Confederation through its early transition into a settled society. His ability to secure loyalty from the major tribes made it possible for the Magyars to act collectively at critical moments. This unity would prove essential as the newly settled people faced growing resistance from the west. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Lechfeld in the mid-10th century. Here, the Magyars, who had long relied on mobility and rapid strikes, encountered a reorganized German army led by Otto I. The German forces used heavily armored cavalry and carefully positioned infantry formations to blunt the effectiveness of Magyar mounted archers. The battle ended with a clear defeat for the Magyars. It was a military turning point, but more importantly, it served as a moment of deep strategic reconsideration. The defeat forced the Magyars to recognize that their raiding tactics, so effective for nearly a century, could no longer serve as the foundation of their security. Europe was changing, and the peoples around them were adapting. Continued reliance on constant warfare would only provoke stronger retaliation. If the Magyars were to survive as a distinct people in the Carpathian Basin, they needed to adopt new political and military strategies more suited to a settled society surrounded by organized states. This realization accelerated several profound changes. First, the Magyars began shifting their economy from one dominated by pastoralism toward more stable agriculture. Farming required predictable seasons, reliable access to land, and long-term planning, all of which encouraged greater social cohesion. Second, the Confederation began to form more permanent fortifications and defensive structures, reflecting the need to guard not only people, but territory. Third, political authority within the Magyar community continued to consolidate. While the tribal system did not disappear overnight, leadership became more focused within the emerging Arpad Dynasty. which increasingly acted as the central axis of Magyar political life. The transition would eventually lead the Magyars to seek acceptance within the broader European world. But even before formal Christianization and the establishment of a kingdom, the seeds of this shift were already present. Groups that had once lived entirely by migration and warfare were now laying down roots, adopting new forms of law and governance, and negotiating their place among powerful neighbors. The Carpathian Basin itself played a significant role in this transformation. The land required organization, irrigation, boundaries, crop cycles, and stable villages. These basic demands encouraged the development of administrative structures. Over time, these structures made it possible for rulers to exercise authority beyond simple tribal allegiance, forming the basis of statehood. By the end of the 10th century, the Magyars had already undergone a profound transformation. They had shifted from a nomadic, raid-based society to a people increasingly rooted in the Carpathian Basin, developing agriculture, permanent settlements, and a more centralized form of leadership. Yet, one essential step remained before Hungary could emerge as a fully recognized European state: the adoption of Christianity and the creation of a stable, hereditary monarchy capable of engaging with the powers of medieval Europe. This transformation would take place under the leadership of a ruler who later generations would remember as Saint Stephen, the first crowned king of Hungary. The Christianization of the Magyars did not happen overnight. Missionaries from both the Latin West and the Byzantine East had reached the Carpathian Basin well before the rise of Stephen, leaving behind traces of early conversions and small Christian communities. These efforts, however, remained limited and often centered around local elites rather than the wider population. The Magyar people still practiced a mixture of steppe-influenced spiritual traditions, honoring ancestors and natural forces while relying on shamans for guidance. Such beliefs had served them well in their nomadic past, but they offered little foundation for the kind of long-term political stability the new homeland required. A shift became necessary, and that shift began within the ruling family itself. Stephen, born with the name Vajk, belonged to the Arpad Dynasty, the line descending from the earlier Magyar leaders who had guided the people into the Carpathian Basin. His father, Grand Prince Géza, recognized that survival in Central Europe demanded more than military strength. Surrounded by Christian kingdoms and facing increasing pressure from Western powers, Géza made a strategic decision. He accepted baptism and encouraged the spread of Christianity among the Magyar elite. Although Géza himself was not fully committed to abandoning traditional practices, his choice signaled a clear direction for the future. Vajk was baptized and given the Christian name Stephen, reportedly in honor of Saint Stephen, the first martyr. His upbringing reflected a deliberate attempt to blend Magyar traditions with the expectations of a Christian ruler. He was trained in leadership, warfare, and diplomacy, but also exposed to Christian teachings and the administrative models of the Latin West. As he matured, Stephen began to envision a future in which Hungary would not be an isolated or vulnerable enclave, but a recognized Christian kingdom, protected by alliances and strengthened by shared faith. Before such a kingdom could be established, internal resistance had to be overcome. Not all Magyar leaders supported Christianization or the rise of a centralized monarchy. Some remained loyal to earlier beliefs and preferred the traditional structure in which power was distributed among various tribal chiefs. Among Stephen's most significant rivals was Kopani, a powerful leader who followed the old system of seniority. According to this traditional custom, Kopani believed he had the rightful claim to succeed Géza. Stephen, however, represented a new political model. Succession based not on age, but on dynastic inheritance, consistent with Christian and European norms. Conflict between the two visions became inevitable. After Geza's death, tensions escalated rapidly. Copine rallied supporters who feared losing their status under the changes Stephen proposed. Stephen, aware that his position was fragile, sought support beyond the tribal networks. He aligned himself with the church and with Western allies, including knights from the region of Bavaria who were sympathetic to Christian expansion eastward. When the decisive battle came, Stephen's forces prevailed. This victory carried immense symbolic weight. It was not merely a personal triumph, but a statement that Hungary would move forward under a centralized Christian monarchy, rather than return to the old tribal framework. With internal opposition subdued, Stephen turned to establishing legitimacy on the international stage. He sought recognition from the papacy, which played a crucial role in conferring royal authority in medieval Europe. The legend states that Stephen received a crown from Pope Sylvester II as a symbol of Hungary's acceptance into the Christian world. While historians continue to debate the exact details, what matters is that Stephen gained the moral and diplomatic authority he needed. He was no longer simply the leader of a tribal confederation. He stood as King Stephen, ruler of a newborn Christian kingdom. Crowning a king was only the beginning. Stephen understood that building a functioning kingdom required administrative reforms, religious institutions, and a population willing, or at least able, to adapt to new structures. One of his first priorities was the organization of the church. He established dioceses in key locations across his territory and invited monks and priests from abroad to support missionary work. Monasteries and parish churches became centers of learning, social organization, and spiritual instruction. They taught new agricultural methods, introduced written record-keeping, and helped connect Hungary to the larger Christian world. Stephen also introduced a new administrative system based on counties, each governed by an appointed official who represented royal authority. These officials were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and enforcing laws. The creation of this system marked a significant departure from the decentralized rule of earlier generations. Royal fortresses, built across the kingdom, supported these officials and strengthened the king's control over distant regions. As the kingdom expanded its administrative structures, it also needed clear rules. To address this, Stephen issued a series of laws that shaped early Hungarian society. These laws promoted Christian morality, regulated trade and property, and outlined the duties of nobles and common people. They often reflected the realities of a society transitioning from tribal customs to a Christian monarchy. For example, Stephen emphasized the importance of attending church, respecting religious festivals, and supporting the clergy. At the same time, he sought to protect the vulnerable and maintain social stability. His laws consistently praised the value of peace and order, reflecting his belief that a united kingdom depended on moral discipline as much as military strength. Stephen's efforts brought significant change to everyday life. Villages grew around parish churches, and agricultural practices became more stable as Christian calendars influenced planting and harvesting cycles. The introduction of tithes, though sometimes resisted, linked local communities to broader religious networks. Craftsmen and merchants gained new opportunities as the kingdom's economy expanded beyond pastoral traditions. Over time, these developments helped integrate Hungary into European trade routes and cultural exchanges. Despite these significant strides, Stephen faced ongoing challenges. Pagan revolts erupted in some regions where the new religion threatened long-standing customs. These revolts, while eventually suppressed, exposed the tensions inherent in rapid transformation. Stephen responded by strengthening his alliances with Christian neighbors and reinforcing the authority of the church within his kingdom. He also encouraged marriage alliances between Hungarian nobles and European families, further binding the kingdom to the wider Christian world. One of Stephen's most enduring legacies was his emphasis on the moral responsibilities of rulers. In a letter traditionally attributed to him, written to his son Emmerich, Stephen advised that a king should rule with humility, justice, and hospitality toward foreigners. Whether or not the letter survives in its exact original form, the values it expresses reflect the character later generations associated with Stephen's reign. He envisioned a kingdom grounded not simply in military power, but in virtue, stability, and cooperation among its diverse peoples. With the coronation of King Stephen and the establishment of a Christian monarchy, Hungary entered a new chapter in its history. The Arpad Dynasty, descended from the early Magyar leaders, now faced the task of turning Stephen's foundational work into a lasting medieval state. This would require political stability, territorial consolidation, and the careful development of institutions capable of supporting a growing kingdom. Over the next several centuries, the Arpad rulers shaped Hungary into a significant power of Central Europe, navigating internal challenges and external pressures while strengthening the structures that would define the kingdom throughout the Middle Ages. The early Arpad kings who followed Stephen had to balance two essential goals. First, they needed to preserve the Christian and administrative framework that Stephen had created. Second, they had to adapt this framework to new realities as Hungary expanded, interacted with neighboring states, and integrated diverse populations. These rulers inherited a kingdom that was still relatively young. While Stephen had established dioceses, counties, and royal authority, these institutions were not yet deeply rooted. The Arpad kings therefore dedicated considerable effort to reinforcing them, ensuring that Christianity and centralized rule became enduring features of Hungarian life. One of the significant developments during this era was the growth of the county system, known as the comitatus. Each county was overseen by a royal official who acted on behalf of the king. These officials collected taxes, enforced laws, and led military contingents when necessary. The county became the backbone of royal administration, creating a standardized structure across the kingdom. Over time, these regions developed their own local elites, who gained influence by managing estates, supporting churches, and serving in royal councils. This expanding noble class would eventually play a central role in Hungary's political evolution. At the same time, the Arpad kings worked to strengthen the church, recognizing that religious unity supported political unity. Monasteries multiplied across the kingdom, often founded by aristocratic families seeking spiritual prestige and influence. These monastic centers became hubs of literacy, record-keeping, and cultural exchange. They preserved chronicles, copied religious texts, and helped educate clergy and nobles. The increase in monastic life also connected Hungary more deeply to the broader Christian world. Foreign monks from places such as France, Italy, and the German lands traveled to Hungary, bringing new ideas in art, architecture, and theology. As the internal structures of the kingdom strengthened, Hungary began to participate more actively in regional politics. The Arpad kings understood that Hungary's position at the crossroads of Central Europe required both diplomacy and military readiness. To the west, the Holy Roman Empire remained a powerful and sometimes aggressive neighbor. To the south, the Byzantine Empire and later the emerging powers of the Balkans influenced the kingdom's strategy. To the north and east, various Slavic and nomadic groups created shifting alliances and conflicts. Navigating this complex environment required skilled leadership and an ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Under kings such as Ladislaus I and Koloman, Hungary expanded its influence into surrounding regions. Ladislaus, remembered for his military abilities and sense of justice, strengthened the kingdom's frontiers and brought stability during a period of internal strife. His reign helped solidify Christian norms and reinforce the role of law in governance. Koloman, who followed him, was known for his interest in scholarship and administration. His laws showed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of governance, reflecting a kingdom confident in its identity and authority. During this period, Hungary also sought to shape the cultural and religious character of its territories. The kings encouraged missionary activity among the peoples living in the borderlands and supported the construction of churches in remote regions. They also issued laws to unify legal practices across diverse populations. While these efforts faced resistance at times, they contributed to a stronger sense of cohesion within the expanding kingdom. One of the most important moments in the development of Hungarian political culture came with the issuance of the Golden Bull of the early 13th century. This document, comparable in significance to the English Magna Carta, marked a key step in defining the rights of the Hungarian nobility and the limits of royal authority. The Golden Bull emerged during the reign of King Andrew II, whose policies of land grants to supporters had weakened the crown's direct resources and empowered large aristocratic families. In response to growing discontent, the Golden Bull set out principles intended to balance royal power and noble privilege. Among its most notable provisions was the right of the nobles to resist the king if he violated the law. This principle, rooted in medieval concepts of justice, became a defining feature of Hungary's constitutional tradition. The Golden Bull also confirmed the privileges of the lesser nobility, known as the servientes, who played an increasingly important role in local governance and defense. By acknowledging their rights, the document helped create a broader political community within the kingdom. Over the centuries, this legal and constitutional framework would become a source of national pride and continuity, reinforcing the idea that Hungary's political order rested on mutual obligations between ruler and subjects. Yet even as the Arpad Dynasty strengthened the kingdom internally, Hungary faced significant external challenges. One of the most devastating came from the east, the Mongol Invasion of the mid-13th century. While this catastrophe belongs to the next stage of Hungarian history and will be explored in detail later, it is important to understand how the Arpad Dynasty's earlier developments influenced the kingdom's ability to confront such a threat. The expansive administrative networks, fortified royal centers, and noble responsibilities established over the preceding centuries formed the foundation of Hungary's resilience. Without the political consolidation achieved under the Arpad kings, the Mongol invasion might have resulted in a complete collapse, rather than a temporary devastation followed by recovery. Another important feature of this era was the growing diversity of the kingdom. As Hungary expanded its borders and incorporated new regions, it included various ethnic groups: Slavs, Germans, Romanians, Pechenegs, and others, each contributing to the cultural mosaic of the realm. The Arpad kings generally pursued policies that allowed these groups a certain degree of autonomy, especially in local customs and settlement patterns. This pluralism became one of Hungary's defining characteristics. While it created occasional tensions, it also enriched the kingdom and allowed it to draw on a wide range of skills and traditions. By the early 13th century, Hungary had developed into a substantial medieval kingdom with established laws, a strengthened nobility, and a growing economy. Yet even with these achievements, the kingdom was not prepared for the sweeping force that descended upon Europe from the east. The Mongol Empire, forged under the leadership of Genghis Khan and expanded by his successors, became one of the most formidable military powers in world history. Its rapid westward advance brought devastation to numerous regions, and eventually it would reach the heart of Central Europe. For Hungary, the Mongol invasion marked one of the darkest and most transformative episodes of the Middle Ages. The Mongol threat first became known to European rulers through fragmented reports. Travelers, missionaries, and merchants returning from the east warned of a powerful force capable of overwhelming entire armies. Yet, many leaders underestimated the danger, believing these distant warriors posed no immediate threat to the well-defended kingdoms of Europe. Among them was King Bela, the fourth of Hungary, a young ruler who had recently inherited a kingdom weakened by internal disputes and shifting noble loyalties. Bela was attempting to strengthen royal authority and rebuild the crown's resources when news of the Mongols reached him. One of Bela's early decisions would prove both bold and consequential. In an attempt to repopulate frontier regions and strengthen the kingdom's defenses, he invited the Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people fleeing the Mongol advance, to settle within Hungary. He hoped they would serve as valuable allies, familiar with steppe warfare and able to reinforce Hungary's eastern borders. The Mongols, however, used this as a pretext for confrontation, accusing Bela of harboring enemies of their empire. This accusation became one of the reasons the Mongols gave for their later attack. The invasion began in earnest when Mongol forces, led by Batu Khan and Subutai, crossed into Hungarian territory. Their approach was swift and relentless. The Mongol army, known for its deadly combination of mounted archers, disciplined formations, and advanced tactics, left destruction in its wake. They moved quickly, attacking fortresses, towns, and villages with terrifying efficiency. Many Hungarian forces, unprepared for the speed and precision of the Mongol assault, struggled to mount an effective defense. One of the major clashes of the invasion occurred near the Sajo River, often referred to as the Battle of Mohi. King Bela attempted to gather his nobles and soldiers for a unified response. Although the Hungarian army was sizable, it lacked the coordination and tactical discipline that characterized the Mongol forces. During the battle, the Mongols executed complex maneuvers that encircled and overwhelmed the Hungarian troops. The result was catastrophic. Many nobles and soldiers were killed, and the remaining forces were scattered. Bela himself narrowly escaped and fled westward in search of refuge. Following this victory, the Mongols spread across the kingdom, destroying settlements, killing vast numbers of inhabitants, and burning agricultural lands. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of ruin, villages emptied, fields left barren, and churches reduced to rubble. The invaders showed no hesitation in using terror as a tool, aiming to break morale and prevent resistance. The devastation was not limited to the plains. Even fortified towns, which offered more resistance, eventually fell after prolonged sieges or starvation. The impact on the population was severe. Many communities were entirely wiped out. Others suffered losses so great that surviving residents fled into forests, mountains, or distant regions. Trade and agriculture collapsed, and famine soon spread. For many months, the kingdom endured one of the bleakest periods in its history. The Mongol occupation, however, was not permanent. After a period of destruction and plunder, the invaders withdrew unexpectedly. The reasons for this sudden departure are still discussed by historians, but many agree that the death of the Great Khan in Mongolia required Mongol leaders to return east for the selection of a successor. Whatever the cause, the withdrawal left behind a shattered kingdom in desperate need of recovery. When King Bela returned, he found a land scarred by war. Instead of despairing, however, he began one of the most ambitious reconstruction efforts in medieval Europe. Bela's response to the crisis demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the lessons of the Mongol invasion. He realized that the kingdom's traditional defenses, based on open-field cavalry warfare and lightly fortified settlements, had been ineffective against the Mongols' siege technologies and disciplined tactics. In response, Bela initiated major reforms aimed at strengthening Hungary's ability to withstand future invasions. One of his most significant initiatives was the construction of stone fortresses. The Mongols had found wooden fortifications easy to burn or breach, but stone structures proved far more resilient. Bela encouraged nobles, bishops, and even some towns to build stone castles, offering land grants and privileges as incentives. Over the next decades, Hungary saw a dramatic increase in fortified structures. These castles became symbols of resilience and centers of local administration, often positioned strategically to guard important routes or river crossings. Bela also sought to rebuild the population. The Mongol invasion had killed so many that entire regions sat empty. To restore productivity and revive the economy, Bela invited settlers from neighboring areas, including Germans, Slavs, and other groups, to repopulate devastated lands. These new communities brought skills in farming, craftsmanship, and urban development, contributing to the kingdom's recovery. The diversity that emerged during this period enriched Hungary's cultural and economic life, adding new layers to the kingdom's identity. Another crucial reform involved the military. Bela understood that reliance on traditional light cavalry was insufficient. He promoted the development of heavy cavalry and improved defensive equipment, allowing Hungary to adopt tactics more suited to defending fixed fortifications. He also expanded the role of the nobility in military service, ensuring that each major landowner was responsible for providing troops and maintaining defenses. These changes helped create a more balanced military structure, combining mobility with strong defensive capabilities. The reconstruction efforts extended to the economy. Bela supported the growth of towns, granting many urban centers new rights and privileges. These towns became hubs of trade and craftsmanship, helping stabilize the kingdom's finances. Markets were rebuilt, roads repaired, and trade routes re-established. Over time, these urban developments contributed to a gradual shift toward greater economic complexity and prosperity. Bela's reforms earned him the title, the second founder of the state, a recognition of how profoundly he reshaped the kingdom after the Mongol devastation. His efforts laid the foundation for a more resilient Hungary, better equipped to handle future conflicts. The population began to grow again, agricultural production recovered, and fortified towns restored a sense of security. Hungary's political structures, though tested, remained intact, showing the strength of the institutions built by earlier kings. The end of the Arpad Dynasty in the early 14th century brought Hungary into a period of uncertainty. With no surviving male heirs from the royal line that had guided the kingdom since the era of Arpad, rival claimants and foreign powers quickly turned their attention toward Hungary's vacant throne. Yet from this turbulent moment emerged a new dynasty that revitalized the kingdom and ushered in an era of economic prosperity, administrative reform, and cultural flourishing. This was the period of the Angevin, or Anjou, kings, whose rule marked one of the brightest chapters in medieval Hungarian history. The accession of the Angevin rulers was rooted in dynastic ties. The Arpad line had intermarried with European noble families for generations, including the French royal house of Anjou. When the Arpad dynasty ended, these connections allowed Charles I of Anjou to present a legitimate claim to the Hungarian crown. His claim was not universally accepted at first. Several local barons and foreign contenders sought to assert their own authority, leading to years of conflict and negotiation. But Charles I possessed the qualities needed to assert royal power: determination, political skill, and the backing of influential allies abroad. During the early years of his reign, Charles I confronted a kingdom fractured by the rise of powerful baronial families. These regional magnates had accumulated extensive lands and personal armies, using the weakened royal authority to carve out semi-independent domains. Restoring central power required careful strategy. Charles I did not confront all his opponents at once. Instead, he targeted them individually, using diplomacy in some cases and military force in others. Over time, he succeeded in dismantling the most rebellious baronies and reasserting the authority of the crown across the kingdom. With internal stability gradually restored, Charles I shifted his attention to strengthening Hungary's economic foundations. He recognized that a prosperous kingdom depended on reliable revenues, infrastructure, and trade. One of his most significant reforms involved the reorganization of the kingdom's mining operations. Hungary possessed valuable mineral resources, particularly gold and silver. Under Charles I, mining production expanded dramatically. Foreign miners, especially skilled German specialists, were invited to settle and work in Hungarian mining towns. Their expertise helped transform Hungary into one of Europe's leading producers of precious metals. Royal income from mining grew, providing funds for administration, military expansion, and diplomatic activities. Charles I also reformed currency and encouraged the development of markets. He introduced a standardized coinage that stabilized economic transactions and improved trade relations with neighboring states. Market towns gained new privileges, allowing them to hold fairs and establish guilds. These towns became centers of commerce and craftsmanship, contributing to the rise of a wealthier urban population. Over the course of his reign, Hungary's economy became more integrated with the broader European system, linking the kingdom to trade networks stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic coast. After the reign of Charles I, his son Louis the Great inherited a kingdom that had grown more unified and prosperous. Louis the Great, whose reign lasted for several decades, expanded upon the reforms of his father and elevated Hungary to a position of considerable influence in Central and Eastern Europe. He earned his epithet, the Great, not only because of his military successes, but also because of his dedication to justice, administration, and cultural life. One of Louis's most important contributions was the further expansion of royal justice. He sought to ensure fairness across the kingdom, issuing laws that protected common people as well as nobles. His legislation regulated inheritance, clarified criminal procedures, and strengthened the rights of those who held land under royal authority. These legal reforms reinforced the idea that the king mediated justice for all subjects, not merely the aristocracy. This image of a just and fair ruler became central to Louis's reputation, both within Hungary and among neighboring realms. Louis the Great also pursued ambitious foreign policies. Through military campaigns, he extended Hungarian influence into regions such as Galicia and parts of the Balkans. In some cases, his campaigns were justified as responses to threats or disputes. In others, they reflected the broader medieval pattern of dynastic ambition. Whatever the case, Hungary became a more assertive regional power during his reign. These victories enhanced the kingdom's prestige and helped secure its borders during a time of shifting alliances and regional turbulence. Culturally, the Angevin period marked a flourishing of art, architecture, and intellectual life. Royal courts under Charles I and Louis the Great welcomed scholars, artists, and clerics from across Europe. This influx of talent brought new styles and ideas that blended with existing traditions. Churches and monasteries constructed during this era reflected the Gothic architectural style spreading across the continent, with soaring arches, intricate stonework, and richly decorated interiors. Manuscript production increased as monasteries copied religious texts, illuminated manuscripts, and recorded historical chronicles. Though literacy remained limited among the general population, the educated clergy and noble classes benefited from this intellectual activity, strengthening cultural ties between Hungary and the rest of Europe. The Angevin kings also encouraged diplomatic marriages that linked Hungary to other royal houses. These alliances not only secured Hungary's place within the European political order, but also facilitated cultural exchange. Queens and princesses brought their own customs, fashions, and courtly traditions to Hungary, enriching the kingdom's cultural landscape. Such exchanges made the royal court an important center of European diplomacy and aristocratic culture. Despite the positive developments during this period, the Angevin rulers also faced complex challenges. As the power of the monarchy grew, some nobles worried that their traditional privileges were threatened. Although outright rebellion was limited, tensions simmered beneath the surface, especially among families that had lost influence during the centralization efforts of earlier decades. The kings managed these tensions through careful negotiation and by granting selective privileges that maintained noble loyalty without undermining royal authority. Another persistent challenge came from the kingdom's diverse population. Hungary's borders encompassed numerous ethnic and linguistic groups, including Slavs, Germans, Romanians, and others. While the Arpad Dynasty had long tolerated this diversity, managing these groups became increasingly important as the state grew more centralized. The Angevin kings sought to integrate them more fully into the kingdom's administrative and legal frameworks, though this process was uneven and sometimes met resistance. Nevertheless, the ability of the Hungarian monarchy to maintain stability across a diverse population contributed to the kingdom's resilience and adaptability. In addition to internal matters, external pressures shaped the latter part of the Angevin period. The rise of powerful neighboring states introduced new strategic concerns. Although Hungary remained strong under Louis the Great, his death brought uncertainty. Louis left no surviving sons, and succession once again became a contentious issue. His daughter Mary inherited the throne, but her reign was marked by political instability and conflicts among rival noble factions. These disputes revealed underlying fractures that had been held in check during the strong leadership of Charles I and Louis the Great. As the medieval period progressed, the stability Hungary enjoyed under the Angevin kings gradually gave way to new challenges. The political landscape of Central and Eastern Europe was undergoing dramatic changes. The most significant of these was the steady rise of the Ottoman Empire, a powerful state expanding from Anatolia into the Balkans. While Hungary had faced external threats before, none posed as sustained or transformative a challenge as the Ottomans. In response to this growing danger, Hungary would eventually turn to one of its most remarkable rulers, Matthias Corvinus, a king whose military reforms, administrative innovations, and cultural patronage reshaped the kingdom during a critical period. The Ottoman advance during the late medieval era altered the balance of power across southeastern Europe. Over several generations, the Ottomans captured important cities, subdued rival states, and established a strong presence in the Balkans. As they moved northward, Hungary found itself positioned as a frontier kingdom at the edge of Christian Europe. The threat was not immediate at first, but as Ottoman forces approached the kingdom's southern borders, the Hungarian leaders recognized the need for stronger defenses, more effective military organization, and renewed unity among the nobility. The political situation within Hungary, however, was becoming increasingly strained. After the death of Louis the Great, disputes over succession led to periods of instability and conflict among powerful aristocratic families. These divisions weakened the central authority and made it difficult to respond effectively to external challenges. The nobles often disagreed on strategy, and regional magnates continued to assert significant independence. At a time when unity was essential, Hungary struggled to maintain a cohesive political structure. Amid this uncertainty emerged Matthias Corvinus, born into the influential Hunyadi family. His father, John Hunyadi, had already distinguished himself as one of Hungary's most capable military leaders. John Hunyadi gained fame for defending the kingdom against Ottoman attacks, particularly during the notable victory at Belgrade. His actions made him a national hero, but he died before the kingdom could fully benefit from his leadership. His legacy, however, paved the way for Matthias, who inherited both respect from the common people and suspicion from certain nobles wary of the Hunyadi family's growing influence. When Matthias ascended to the throne, he faced enormous challenges. He was young, and his claim to the crown was not universally accepted. Several noble factions opposed him, and foreign powers sought to influence Hungarian politics to their advantage. Despite this difficult start, Matthias quickly demonstrated exceptional political skill and determination. He managed to build alliances, navigate court factions, and secure recognition as the rightful king. His early actions showed a clear vision for strengthening royal authority and reforming the kingdom in preparation for the dangers ahead. One of Matthias's greatest contributions was the creation of a professional standing army known as the Black Army. Unlike traditional medieval forces that relied mainly on nobles providing troops, the Black Army consisted of paid soldiers who served directly under the king's command. This force included skilled cavalry, infantry, and mercenaries from various regions. Their discipline and training made them one of the most effective military units in Europe during the 15th century. With this force, Matthias was able not only to defend Hungary's borders, but also to project power beyond them. The Black Army played a crucial role in Matthias's campaigns against both the Ottomans and rival European powers. While the Ottoman threat remained a constant concern, Matthias recognized that Hungary also needed to strengthen its position within Central Europe. He pursued military actions in regions such as Moravia, Silesia, and parts of Austria. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They weakened potential adversaries, expanded Hungary's influence, and provided additional resources to support the kingdom's military and administrative systems. Although these conflicts sometimes strained relations with neighboring states, they demonstrated Matthias's ambition to transform Hungary into a strong and independent power. Military success alone, however, could not secure the kingdom's future. Matthias implemented significant administrative reforms designed to strengthen the monarchy and improve governance. He reorganized the tax system to ensure a more reliable flow of revenue, reducing corruption and increasing efficiency. He also promoted loyal and competent officials, often choosing individuals based on merit rather than noble birth. This approach challenged traditional aristocratic privileges but made the royal administration more effective. These changes contributed to the stability and resilience of the kingdom during Matthias's reign. Culturally, Matthias Corvinus became one of the most influential patrons of the Renaissance in Central Europe. His court in Buda attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from across the continent. Under his patronage, libraries and schools flourished. One of the most famous cultural achievements of his reign was the Corvina Library, a collection of beautifully illuminated manuscripts and scholarly works written by some of the brightest intellectuals of the Renaissance. Though much of the library was later dispersed or destroyed, its legacy as a symbol of Hungarian cultural advancement endures. Matthias's support for the arts and sciences reflected his broader vision for Hungary. He wanted the kingdom not only to be militarily strong, but also to be recognized as a refined and educated society. His embrace of Renaissance ideas helped bring Hungary closer to the cultural developments shaping Western Europe. Hungarian nobles who visited the royal court were exposed to new architectural styles, philosophical ideas, and artistic forms, gradually spreading Renaissance influences throughout the kingdom. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, Hungary found itself in a precarious position. The strong leadership and reforms of Matthias Corvinus had elevated the kingdom. But after his death, royal authority weakened rapidly. Successive kings struggled to replicate his achievements, and political divisions deepened among the Hungarian nobility. Meanwhile, to the south, the Ottoman Empire continued its relentless expansion. This growing imbalance, Hungary's internal fragility and the Ottomans' rising power, set the stage for one of the most devastating turning points in Hungarian history: the Battle of Mohacs and the subsequent division of the kingdom into three distinct parts. The decades following Matthias's death were marked by instability. Hungarian nobles argued over succession, competed for influence, and often placed their own interests above those of the kingdom. Royal revenues declined, making it difficult to maintain strong defenses or support a standing army comparable to the Black Army Matthias had once commanded. Many fortresses along the southern frontier fell into disrepair. At the same time, the young King Louis II, who inherited the throne as a child, lacked the political experience and authority necessary to control the fractious nobility. His reign became shaped by competing advisors, unstable alliances, and growing financial difficulties. While Hungary struggled with internal challenges, the Ottoman Empire was reaching the height of its power under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman's ambition extended beyond the Balkans. He viewed Hungary as both a strategic target and a pathway toward broader dominance in Europe. Ottoman forces had already captured key cities in the Balkans, weakening the buffer zones that once protected Hungary. Each advance brought the Ottomans closer to Hungary's southern border, increasing pressure on a kingdom ill-prepared to repel such a formidable force. Diplomatic efforts to unite Europe against the Ottoman threat had limited success. Appeals to the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and other Christian rulers often resulted in promises but little actual support. Many European states were preoccupied with their own conflicts, especially the power struggle between the Habsburgs and France. Hungary, positioned between these great powers, received sympathy but few reinforcements. As the Ottoman threat intensified, Hungary stood largely alone. The crisis reached its climax in the year of the Battle of Mohacs. When Suleiman launched a major campaign toward Hungary, King Louis II attempted to gather forces from across the kingdom. Noble armies responded unevenly. Some arrived quickly, while others delayed or sent insufficient troops. Despite the limited preparation, Louis felt compelled to confront the Ottomans. Allowing the enemy to advance deeper into Hungarian territory without resistance risked catastrophic consequences. Thus, the Hungarian forces marched southward and took position near the town of Mohacs on the Danube plain. The battlefield at Mohacs offered little strategic advantage. Open and flat, it favored the Ottomans' superior numbers and artillery. The Hungarian army, significantly smaller and lacking unified command, faced a highly organized and experienced Ottoman force. When the battle began, Hungarian cavalry launched a brave charge, temporarily disrupting the Ottoman front lines. However, Ottoman firepower and disciplined infantry quickly halted their momentum. The Hungarian attack, bold but poorly coordinated, left their flank exposed. As the Ottomans counterattacked, their numerical superiority and tactical organization overwhelmed the Hungarian forces. The battle ended in a devastating defeat, often described by Hungarian historians as a national tragedy. King Louis II attempted to flee the battlefield, but in the chaos, he fell into a river and drowned. His death symbolized the collapse of the medieval Hungarian state. Thousands of soldiers and nobles were killed, and the Ottoman advance into the heart of Hungary became unstoppable. The aftermath of Mohacs brought far-reaching consequences. With the king dead and no clear heir, a succession crisis emerged. Two rival factions supported different candidates. One group backed John Zapolya, a powerful Transylvanian noble with significant support among the eastern nobles. The other supported Ferdinand of Habsburg, related to Louis II through marriage and backed by strong dynastic claims. Both men were crowned king, resulting in a divided monarchy. This dispute further weakened Hungary at the very moment it faced unprecedented external pressure. Suleiman, recognizing the opportunity provided by Hungary's confusion, moved to secure key territories. Ottoman forces captured Buda, the symbolic center of the kingdom. Over time, they established direct control over the central regions of Hungary, integrating them into the Ottoman administrative system. Towns and fortresses became stations for Ottoman officials, soldiers, and settlers. The once unified kingdom now found itself split into three major regions. The first region was Ottoman-occupied central Hungary, including Buda and much of the Great Plain. This territory became part of the Ottoman Empire, governed by pashas who implemented Ottoman law, taxation, and military administration. Life under Ottoman rule varied from place to place. Some towns retained a measure of local autonomy, while others were heavily taxed or subject to military oversight. For rural populations, the shift meant adjusting to new legal structures and unfamiliar authorities. Despite the hardships, Ottoman rule also introduced new cultural influences, architectural styles, and trade networks that linked the region to the broader Ottoman world. The second region became known as Royal Hungary, ruled by the Habsburgs from their strongholds in the western and northern parts of the former kingdom. Here, the Habsburgs established a defensive frontier against the Ottomans. Royal Hungary remained formally part of the Kingdom of Hungary, but in practice it became integrated into the Habsburg monarchy. This integration brought new administrative practices, closer ties to Central European politics, and increasing influence from the Holy Roman Empire. Vienna, rather than Buda, became the central hub for decisions affecting this part of Hungary. The third region, the Principality of Transylvania, emerged as a semi-autonomous state. Though often influenced by the Ottomans, Transylvania maintained considerable internal independence. Its princes balanced diplomacy carefully, paying tribute to the Ottomans while also negotiating with the Habsburgs and other European powers. This unique position allowed Transylvania to develop into a culturally vibrant region. It became known for relative religious tolerance and for preserving key elements of Hungarian political and cultural identity during a time when other parts of the kingdom were under foreign rule. This tripartite division reshaped Hungary for generations. The unity that had characterized the Arpad and Angevin eras was replaced by fragmentation, competing allegiances, and divergent political paths. The cultural, economic, and social life of each region evolved differently. Royal Hungary aligned more closely with Habsburg Central Europe, Ottoman Hungary integrated into the broader imperial system, and Transylvania developed a distinctive blend of influences shaped by its strategic diplomacy. The disaster at Mohacs shattered the political unity of the Hungarian kingdom, creating a fractured landscape that would shape the lives of its people for generations. What had once been a single medieval kingdom now became three distinct political entities. The Ottoman-controlled central region, the Habsburg-governed Royal Hungary in the west and north, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania in the east. Each of these territories developed in different ways, influenced by contrasting political systems, religious policies, and cultural forces. Understanding this era requires shifting our perspective from grand military campaigns to the daily experiences of those who lived through one of the most complex and transformative periods in Hungarian history. Life in the central region under Ottoman rule differed markedly from what Hungarians had known before. When the Ottoman Empire incorporated large parts of central Hungary into its administrative system, it introduced new institutions, tax structures, and social norms. Ottoman officials, known as pashas or beys, governed major towns from fortified centers. Their authority extended over the collection of taxes, maintenance of order, and oversight of local affairs. While some continuity remained, local village leaders continued to manage everyday matters in many communities. The overall governance reflected the priorities of a distant imperial system. Taxation became one of the most significant impacts on everyday life. The Ottomans implemented a detailed and often heavy system of levies, including land taxes, head taxes, and fees on market activity. Although some of these taxes mirrored medieval Hungarian practices, the scale and frequency of collection placed new burdens on rural communities. However, it is important to recognize that the Ottoman approach was not uniformly oppressive. In many cases, the empire allowed agricultural villages to continue operating much as before, as long as they fulfilled their obligations. This pragmatic stance meant that while life was difficult, many villages adapted and survived. Urban centers, meanwhile, underwent more noticeable transformation. Towns such as Buda, once vibrant hubs of medieval Hungarian administration, now reflected Ottoman architectural and cultural influences. Mosques, baths, and public fountains appeared alongside older structures. Markets flourished, connecting Hungary to trade routes stretching toward the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and Anatolia. Artisans from various regions, including Greek, Armenian, and Turkish communities, settled in these towns, adding to the cultural diversity. Although the displacement caused by war had severely reduced the Hungarian population in many urban areas, new groups filled the gaps, creating a multicultural environment unlike anything Hungary had known before. The presence of Islam in the region added another dimension to cultural life. While Christians remained the majority, Islamic religious practices became part of the daily rhythm in Ottoman-controlled towns. The call to prayer echoed from minarets, and Islamic courts handled certain legal matters. Yet, despite these visible changes, the Ottoman Empire generally did not force conversion. In fact, the religious landscape of central Hungary remained diverse, as the empire allowed various Christian denominations to function, though often with restrictions. In contrast, life in royal Hungary under Habsburg rule followed a very different trajectory. The Habsburgs presented themselves as defenders of Christendom, committed to halting Ottoman expansion and restoring Catholic influence across the region. From their stronghold in the western part of the former kingdom, they built a defensive frontier system, constructing and reinforcing fortresses along the borderlands. This defensive belt became known as the military frontier, a region characterized by constant vigilance, frequent skirmishes, and a population shaped by military discipline. Under Habsburg administration, Catholicism regained a dominant role. The Counter-Reformation, a movement aimed at restoring Catholic authority in response to Protestant growth, became especially influential in royal Hungary. Jesuit missionaries established schools, churches, and cultural centers intended to promote Catholic teaching. The Habsburgs supported these efforts, viewing religious unity as essential for political control. As a result, Protestant communities, Lutheran, Calvinist, and others, often faced pressure, restrictions, and occasional persecution. These tensions created deep religious divides that would shape Hungarian society for centuries. Despite the challenges posed by war and military governance, royal Hungary also experienced cultural and economic renewal. Cities such as Pozsony, modern Bratislava, and Nagyszombat, modern Trnava, grew as administrative and educational centers. Nobles who had fled from Ottoman-occupied territories established new estates in the west, contributing to the region's agricultural production. Trade routes connecting royal Hungary to Austria and Bohemia facilitated economic integration with the Habsburg realms. While this region remained under constant threat from Ottoman incursions, daily life stabilized more quickly than in the devastated central territories. The third region, the Principality of Transylvania, occupied a unique position. Though it was often a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire and paid tribute to maintain its autonomy, Transylvania retained its own internal governance. This independence allowed it to develop distinctive political and cultural features. The Transylvanian Diet, an assembly representing various estates, played an active role in administration. Nobles, Saxon settlers, and secular communities all enjoyed recognized rights and responsibilities. Although not all ethnic groups had equal representation, this system allowed for a degree of local decision-making that contrasted with the more centralized rule of the Ottomans and Habsburgs. Transylvania became particularly notable for its policy of religious tolerance. In a time when much of Europe was torn apart by religious conflict, the Transylvanian Diet issued edicts granting legal recognition to several Christian denominations, including Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Unitarian churches. While other groups, such as Orthodox Christians, lived with fewer privileges, the overall atmosphere in Transylvania encouraged intellectual debate and spiritual diversity. This environment attracted scholars, clergy, and thinkers, helping the region flourish as a cultural center. Under leaders such as John Sigismund and later princes from the Bathory family, Transylvania pursued a delicate diplomacy. Its leaders understood that survival depended on balancing relations with the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. Too much independence risked Ottoman retaliation, while too much alignment with Vienna threatened the principality's autonomy. By skillfully maneuvering between these powers, Transylvanian rulers preserved a space where Hungarian culture and governance could continue to develop relatively freely during an era of fragmentation. For the people living in these three regions, daily life reflected both hardship and adaptation. In Ottoman Hungary, many villages rebuilt after periods of destruction, adjusting to new tax systems and patterns of trade. Peasants cultivated crops, raised livestock, and navigated the demands of Ottoman officials. In some areas, abandoned lands became overgrown, turning once cultivated fields into wilderness. The transformation of the landscape itself became a reminder of the upheaval the kingdom had endured. In Royal Hungary, communities lived in the shadow of constant military threat. The presence of soldiers, fortresses, and frontier regulations shaped everyday routines. At the same time, agricultural estates in safer regions prospered, producing grain, wine, and livestock for local markets. Towns grew around administrative centers, fostering the emergence of a middle class tied to the expanding Habsburg bureaucracy. Transylvania's society, meanwhile, found strength in its mixture of traditions. The coexistence of various ethnic and religious groups required negotiation, compromise, and a shared commitment to stability. Cultural life thrived in cities such as Kolozsvár, modern Cluj-Napoca, where printing presses produced books in multiple languages, and scholars engaged in debates reflective of the broader European intellectual movements of the era. Across all regions, the memory of the once unified Hungarian kingdom persisted. Stories of past kings, the symbol of the Holy Crown, and shared linguistic and cultural traditions continued to bind people together, even when separated by political borders. Nobles and clergy often maintained correspondence across regions, and families displaced by war preserved ties to their ancestral lands. Although divided, Hungary's identity endured beneath the surface of political fragmentation. By the late 17th century, the balance of power in Central Europe had shifted in ways that would profoundly reshape Hungary's future. For more than a century, the kingdom had been divided between Ottoman rule, Habsburg control, and the semi-autonomous Principality of Transylvania. These divisions had preserved certain elements of Hungarian culture and governance, but they also prolonged uncertainty, hardship, and political fragmentation. The time had come for a decisive transformation, one that would see the Ottomans pushed out of most Hungarian lands and the Habsburgs establish firmer authority. Yet this new reality would spark its own tensions. culminating in one of the most significant uprisings in Hungarian history, the War for Independence led by Francis II Rakoczi. The first major shift began as the Ottoman Empire's military power gradually weakened. By the second half of the 17th century, Ottoman expansion had slowed, and defeats on various fronts signaled an empire under strain. European powers, recognizing this vulnerability, formed alliances aimed at halting Ottoman control of Central Europe. Among the most important of these coalitions was the Holy League, a partnership that included the Habsburg monarchy, Poland, Venice, and later Russia. The Habsburgs, eager to reclaim lost territory and secure their eastern frontier, played a leading role in this alliance. A turning point came when the Ottomans launched a major assault on Vienna. The siege of the city became a defining moment not only for the Habsburgs, but for the broader contest between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. The defense of Vienna succeeded thanks to coordinated efforts among European forces, particularly the Polish army, led by King John III Sobieski. The failure of this siege marked the beginning of a long Ottoman retreat from Central Europe. For Hungary, this created a new opening for liberation. Over the following years, Habsburg-led forces advanced steadily into Hungarian territory. Major victories allowed them to recapture key cities and fortresses that had been under Ottoman control for generations. Cities such as Buda, which had been firmly in Ottoman hands, now returned to Hungarian and Habsburg authority. Battles, sieges, and negotiations gradually dismantled the Ottoman presence in the region. The recapture of these lands brought joy to many Hungarians, but it also introduced new uncertainties. Ottoman administration disappeared, but in its place came Habsburg structures that not all Hungarians welcomed. As the Ottomans retreated, the Treaty of Karlowitz formalized the return of most Hungarian lands to Habsburg control. For the first time since the disaster at Mohacs, a significant portion of the kingdom was unified under a single authority. Yet liberation did not equal independence. The Habsburgs, having invested heavily in military campaigns, sought to consolidate their authority over Hungary. They viewed the kingdom not as an autonomous partner, but as a territory needing firm management to prevent future instability. This approach soon created tensions. Many Hungarian nobles expected the restoration of their historic rights, privileges, and local authority once Ottoman rule had ended. They believed that Hungary should function as a distinct kingdom within the Habsburg monarchy, governed by its own laws and traditions. Instead, the Habsburgs imposed centralized measures designed to standardize governance across their realms. In practice, this meant increased taxation, stronger military oversight, and a growing presence of imperial officials. Religious policies also contributed to rising resentment. While Transylvania had long allowed a degree of religious pluralism, many parts of Hungary now faced strict counter-Reformation measures. Catholic influence expanded rapidly, and Protestant communities, particularly Calvinists and Lutherans, experienced restrictions and pressures that they had not known under Ottoman or Transylvanian rule. These measures created deep frustration among nobles and commoners alike, fueling a sense that the Habsburgs intended to reshape Hungary according to their own interests, disregarding Hungarian customs and freedoms. Tensions further escalated when Habsburg authorities confiscated the estates of nobles accused of collaborating with the Ottomans or resisting imperial rule. These confiscations not only weakened the traditional elite, but also redistributed wealth and land into the hands of loyal imperial supporters. For many Hungarian nobles, this felt like an attack on their identity and autonomy. They feared that the centuries-old structure of Hungarian society was being dismantled under foreign influence. Against this backdrop of discontent, smaller rebellions broke out across the kingdom. Peasant uprisings, noble conspiracies, and local conflicts signaled a growing desire to resist Habsburg control. While these revolts were not initially coordinated, they reflected a broader dissatisfaction that cut across social groups. What Hungary lacked was a unifying leader capable of channeling this frustration into a cohesive movement. That leader emerged in the person of Francis II Rakoczi. Born into a powerful Transylvanian noble family, Rakoczi carried both political influence and symbolic significance. His mother, Ilona Zrini, had been a strong defender of Hungarian autonomy, and Rakoczi inherited her determination. Educated in European courts, he possessed a broad understanding of international politics. He also understood the deep longing among Hungarians for a restoration of their old liberties. Rakoczi's rise to leadership of the independence movement began after widespread discontent erupted into open rebellion. He initially attempted diplomacy, seeking foreign support from France and other European powers who opposed Habsburg dominance. Though external assistance was limited, Rakoczi soon became the central figure in a large-scale uprising known as the War of Independence. Nobles, peasants, and frontier soldiers joined his cause, united by the desire to reclaim Hungary's rights and push back against Habsburg centralization. The Rakoczi forces, known as the Kuruk, fought with determination against imperial troops. Their cause was strengthened by widespread dissatisfaction with Habsburg rule, especially in regions where economic hardship and religious oppression were most severe. The Kuruk fighters used flexible tactics, drawing on both noble cavalry traditions and guerrilla-style warfare common in frontier regions. For several years, they achieved significant victories and controlled large parts of the kingdom. Rakoczi's leadership was characterized by a blend of pragmatism and idealism. He sought not only military success, but also political legitimacy. His declarations framed the conflict as a struggle for the preservation of Hungarian laws, liberties, and national dignity. He emphasized the historical tradition of a free Hungarian nobility, resisting foreign domination. Although his movement faced internal divisions and resource shortages, his ability to inspire loyalty remained strong. Despite early successes, the war eventually turned against the Hungarian forces. The Habsburg monarchy possessed greater resources, a larger army, and strong diplomatic support. As European conflicts shifted, potential allies who might have aided Rakoczi's cause turned their attention elsewhere. Gradually, imperial troops retook key territories. The Kuruk armies, lacking consistent supplies and facing mounting losses, struggled to maintain momentum. The early 18th century ushered in a new era for Hungary, one shaped not by foreign conquest or rebellion, but by gradual reform, cultural revival, and intellectual transformation. Although the Habsburg monarchy maintained control over the kingdom following the Treaty of Szatmár, the decades that followed differed markedly from the turmoil of previous centuries. Hungary began to rebuild, recover, and reimagine its place within a rapidly changing Europe. This period did not erase the deep scars left by Ottoman domination or the aspirations raised by Rakoczi's struggle, but it opened space for new movements that would profoundly influence Hungarian society. After the suppression of Rakoczi's War of Independence, the Habsburgs sought to stabilize their rule. They recognized that constant conflict drained resources, invited foreign intervention, and weakened their broader empire. As a result, the monarchy adopted a more conciliatory approach, restoring certain noble privileges and allowing Hungary to retain aspects of its traditional legal and administrative structure, while Vienna continued to exercise strong oversight, especially in military and economic matters. The kingdom regained a measure of political predictability. One of the most influential Habsburg rulers of this era was Empress Maria Theresa. Her reign brought significant reforms that affected nearly every part of Hungarian society. Although she strengthened the centralized power of the monarchy, she was also committed to improving the efficiency and prosperity of her diverse empire. In Hungary, she confirmed noble rights while simultaneously introducing reforms designed to promote economic development and social order. Her policies touched agriculture, taxation, education, and the military. Maria Theresa's land reforms, for instance, sought to regulate the obligations between landlords and peasants. Over the centuries, serfdom had become increasingly burdensome, and many peasants faced harsh treatment and excessive labor requirements. By standardizing these obligations, the reforms aimed to reduce arbitrary abuses and create a more stable rural economy. Although the system of serfdom remained intact, these changes marked an important step toward eventual emancipation. Education also became a priority. Influenced by Enlightenment ideas spreading across Europe, the monarchy recognized that literacy and training were vital for a functioning administrative state. Maria Theresa introduced compulsory primary education, establishing schools in both urban and rural areas. This initiative expanded literacy among the population and helped create a more informed society. Even though access to advanced education remained limited for many, these early steps laid the foundation for a more educated Hungarian public. Her son, Joseph II, took these reforms even further. Inspired by Enlightenment principles of rational governance and individual rights, Joseph II sought to transform the empire through sweeping changes. His reign marked one of the boldest reform periods in Habsburg history, though not one without controversy. Joseph II attempted to centralize administration, reduce noble privileges, promote religious toleration, and modernize the economy. One of his most significant policies was the Edict of Toleration, which granted broader religious freedoms to non-Catholic communities. Protestants and Orthodox Christians gained greater rights to worship, establish schools, and participate in public life. This was a dramatic departure from earlier Counter-Reformation policies that had heavily favored Catholicism. While Catholic authorities resisted such measures, the edict reshaped Hungary's religious landscape, strengthening communities that had endured centuries of discrimination. Joseph II also challenged the long-standing power of the Hungarian nobility. He sought to unify administration across his empire, viewing regional privileges as obstacles to efficient governance. To this end, he issued decrees without consulting the Hungarian Diet and attempted to replace Latin, the traditional language of administration, with German. These measures angered many Hungarian nobles, who saw them not only as infringements on historical rights, but as a threat to national identity. While Joseph believed he was modernizing the state, many Hungarians perceived his reforms as overreach. When Joseph II died, the monarchy revoked several of his more unpopular reforms, particularly those that infringed upon Hungarian autonomy. Yet the broader impact of his Enlightenment-inspired initiatives persisted. They introduced new ideas about individual rights, religious freedom, and the role of government. These ideas circulated among nobles, intellectuals, clergy, and the emerging middle class, planting seeds for Hungary's future movements toward modernization and national self-assertion. Beyond political reforms, the 18th century witnessed a flourishing of Hungarian culture and identity. Writers, historians, and scholars began to explore the origins of the Magyar people, seeking to revive interest in Hungary's ancient past and medieval glory. This cultural revival played a crucial role in shaping the national consciousness that would later fuel reform movements. Language became a central part of this awakening. For centuries, Latin had served as the language of administration, education, and official communication within Hungary. While practical for medieval governance, Latin created a divide between the educated elite and the general population. During the Enlightenment, Intellectuals argued that a modern nation required a living language capable of expressing scientific, political, and cultural ideas. Hungarian writers launched a movement to develop and standardize the Hungarian language, expanding its vocabulary and promoting it in education and literature. This linguistic revival helped strengthen a shared identity across social classes. As more works appeared in Hungarian, poetry, scientific treatises, political essays, the language gained prestige. It became a symbol of national unity, particularly in a kingdom with diverse ethnic groups and a history of foreign domination. The effort to elevate the Hungarian language marked one of the most important cultural developments of the era. Literature and the arts also blossomed. Poets and playwrights drew inspiration from Hungary's past, crafting works that celebrated national heroes, folklore, and historical memories. Scholars produced the first modern histories of Hungary, emphasizing continuity from the age of Arpad and Stephen through the hardships of Ottoman rule and the resilience of the Hungarian people. These narratives strengthened the sense of a collective story, essential for any emerging national movement. Economic changes further supported this burgeoning identity. As agricultural production expanded and trade increased, a middle class slowly emerged. Merchants, craftsmen, and educated professionals became more influential in urban life. This group brought new perspectives and ambitions, often advocating for reforms that would foster greater economic opportunity and social mobility. Their growing presence encouraged discussions about the relationship between the people and the state. By the middle of the 19th century, the spirit of reform and national awakening in Hungary had matured into a powerful social and political force. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, the growing prestige of the Hungarian language, and the emergence of a more politically conscious middle class all laid the groundwork for a dramatic transformation. Across Europe, revolutions were igniting in response to demands for constitutional rights, national self-determination, and social change. Hungary, long shaped by external rule and internal reform, was ready to join this continental wave. The Revolution of 1848 and the subsequent struggle for autonomy marked one of the most defining moments in Hungarian history. The immediate catalyst for revolution emerged from broader European events. In early 1848, the overthrow of the French monarchy sparked uprisings across Europe, from the German states to Italy. News of these movements traveled rapidly, inspiring reformers and nationalists in Hungary. Yet Hungary's revolutionary aims were not simply imitations of foreign events. They were the product of decades of cultural revival and political frustration. Hungarian leaders had long demanded meaningful reforms from the Habsburg monarchy, including modern governance, greater economic freedom, and recognition of Hungary's historical rights. As Europe became engulfed in revolution, Hungarian reformers saw an opportunity to transform these aspirations into tangible action. At the forefront of the reform movement stood Lajos Kossuth, one of the most influential political figures in Hungarian history. A gifted orator and passionate advocate of national rights, Kossuth embodied the aspirations of a society seeking both modernity and autonomy. His speeches, widely disseminated through newspapers and public gatherings, articulated a vision of Hungary as a constitutional nation, capable of governing itself within a reformed Habsburg framework. He called for responsible government, civil liberties, and economic reforms that would bring prosperity to all social classes. The revolutionary momentum accelerated when petitions circulated across the country demanding political change. Students, intellectuals, merchants, and even members of the nobility joined the movement. In Pest, a group of radical young reformers known as the March Youth drew up a list of demands known as the 12 Points. These included freedom of the press, equality before the law, a national army, annual parliamentary sessions, and union with Transylvania. The 12 points became a symbolic manifesto for Hungary's transformation, expressing both liberal and nationalist demands in clear and forceful language. On the 15th of March, a day that would become etched into Hungarian national memory, crowds in Pest gathered to present these demands. They printed the 12 points without censorship, held public assemblies, and compelled local authorities to accept the revolutionary program. The events of that day, peaceful yet decisive, marked the beginning of the revolution. News spread quickly throughout the country, inspiring similar actions in towns and villages. The Habsburg monarchy, weakened by unrest across its territories, conceded to many of the demands. Within months, the Hungarian Diet passed sweeping reforms known as the April Laws. These laws abolished feudal privileges, ended serfdom, established equality before the law, and created a responsible Hungarian ministry accountable to the Diet. For the first time, Hungary had a modern constitutional framework. The April Laws represented a monumental achievement, transforming the kingdom from a semi-feudal society into a more democratic and legally unified state. They reflected the hopes of a nation ready to enter a new era of political autonomy and social reform. Yet the path ahead was far from secure. While the April Laws granted Hungary considerable self-governance, key areas, such as military affairs and foreign policy, remained under Habsburg authority. Tensions quickly emerged between Vienna and the new Hungarian government. Austrian officials, alarmed by the loss of control and fearful that other nationalities within the empire would seek similar freedoms, saw the Hungarian reforms as a direct threat to imperial unity. Complicating matters further, Hungary was not ethnically homogeneous. Nationalist aspirations among various ethnic groups, Slovaks, Serbs, Romanians, and others, often clashed with Hungarian goals. Many of these groups saw the rise of Hungarian nationalism as a potential threat to their own languages, customs, and local autonomy. In several regions, these tensions erupted into conflicts, creating internal divisions that weakened the revolutionary government's ability to resist external pressure. As the year progressed, the Habsburg monarchy, increasingly unstable and faced with revolutions across its empire, turned to military force to regain control. When the court fled Vienna in the face of its own uprising, it reorganized its strategy and sought assistance from conservative forces determined to suppress the revolutions. In this context, the Hungarian struggle became part of a broader counter-revolutionary effort. Vienna declared the April Laws invalid and attempted to impose a centralized constitution on the entire empire. Hungarian leaders refused to accept this reversal, arguing that their reforms were legally enacted and rooted in historical rights. The conflict escalated from political disagreement to armed confrontation. Volunteer militias and newly formed Hungarian military units prepared to defend the revolution. The first clashes took place in the autumn, marking the beginning of the military struggle. Initially, the Hungarian forces achieved notable successes. Inspired by patriotic fervor and led by talented commanders such as Artur Gergely, they pushed back imperial troops and secured key positions. The Hungarian army grew rapidly, attracting volunteers from various social backgrounds. Women supported the war effort by organizing supplies, sewing uniforms, and maintaining communication networks. For a time, it appeared that the revolution might prevail against the odds. Meanwhile, Kossuth emerged as the symbolic leader of the national movement. His ability to articulate the goals of the revolution and inspire the population made him indispensable. In a decisive moment, he declared Hungary independent from Habsburg rule and assumed the role of governor-president. This step represented a bold escalation. What had begun as a movement for autonomy within the empire had now transformed into a full struggle for national independence. But the Habsburgs had powerful allies. Alarmed by the threat of a successful revolution in its neighborhood, the Russian Empire agreed to intervene on behalf of the Habsburgs. Russian troops, numbering far more than the Hungarian forces, swept across the border. Their involvement dramatically shifted the balance of power. Facing Austrian and Russian armies simultaneously, the Hungarian army struggled to hold its ground. The defeat of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 left the kingdom in a profoundly altered state. The aspirations for national autonomy, constitutional government, and civil rights that had energized the revolution did not disappear, but they were forced into a new and often harsh reality. In the years that followed, Hungary entered a period of centralized control imposed by the Habsburg monarchy, a system commonly referred to as neo-absolutism. Although this era restricted political freedoms, it also created circumstances that eventually pushed both Austria and Hungary toward negotiation and, ultimately, the historic Compromise of 1867. This turning point would redefine the relationship between Hungary and the Habsburgs for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, Austrian authorities sought to prevent any resurgence of Hungarian resistance. The monarchy, now under the leadership of Emperor Franz Joseph, abolished the April Laws and dissolved the Hungarian Diet. Local self-government was replaced by imperial bureaucrats, and the use of the Hungarian language in administration was restricted. A network of military and civil officials implemented Vienna's policies with little regard for traditional Hungarian institutions. This centralization was part of a broader Habsburg strategy to tighten control across the empire, which had been shaken by revolutions in multiple regions. The imperial government believed that uniform administration was necessary to maintain stability, especially in a state composed of numerous nationalities with competing ambitions. For Hungary, however, this approach deepened grievances. Nobles resented the loss of influence, intellectuals mourned the suppression of Hungarian culture, and rural communities faced economic burdens as the empire sought to extract resources to pay for its military campaigns. One of the most significant features of neo-absolutism was the emphasis on law and order. Austrian authorities established strict censorship, monitoring newspapers, pamphlets, and public speech for any sign of dissent. Surveillance systems kept watch over potential rebels. In many towns, the presence of imperial troops served as a constant reminder of the restrictions on everyday life. Yet even under these conditions, Hungarian society did not remain passive. Writers and poets continued to express national sentiment through coded language, historical works, and cultural activities. The preservation of Hungarian identity became an act of quiet resistance. While political oppression defined the early years of neo-absolutism, the empire simultaneously pursued modernization. Vienna introduced reforms aimed at improving infrastructure, administrative efficiency, and economic development. Roads, railways, and telegraph lines expanded across Hungarian territory, linking regions that had once been separated by vast distances. These improvements increased trade and facilitated mobility, helping to integrate Hungary more fully into the empire's economic network. The abolition of serfdom, initiated during the Revolutionary Era but confirmed and enforced under imperial administration, transformed the countryside. Former serfs gained personal freedom, though many still struggled with limited land and economic insecurity. Agricultural production remained central to the Hungarian economy, but modernization gradually introduced new tools, techniques, and markets. These changes contributed to the emergence of a more dynamic rural society, even as political constraints remained in place. Despite these reforms, the neo-absolutist system faced growing challenges. Austria's attempt to impose centralized control across diverse lands met resistance from various nationalities. Industrialized regions demanded economic freedoms, while Slavic and Italian communities sought political rights. Hungary was not alone in its dissatisfaction. The empire's overly rigid structure could not accommodate the demands of a rapidly changing Europe. The strain became more evident when the Habsburgs engaged in costly wars. A significant turning point came with the conflict against France and Sardinia over control of northern Italy. Austria suffered notable defeats, exposing weaknesses in its military and administrative systems. These failures undermined confidence in neo-absolutism and forced the monarchy to reconsider its approach to governance. Hungarian leaders, meanwhile, adopted a strategy of legal resistance rather than open rebellion. Among the most influential figures of this period was Ferenc Dék, a statesman known for his calm disposition, moral integrity, and commitment to constitutional principles. Dék believed that Hungary could regain autonomy not through armed conflict, but through negotiation and persistent adherence to legal arguments. He carefully studied historical documents and treaties, demonstrating that Hungary had always possessed constitutional rights that could not be abolished unilaterally. Dék's leadership helped articulate a vision for reconciliation between Hungary and the Habsburgs, one based on mutual recognition, compromise, and shared interests. His ideas gained traction as both Hungarian society and the imperial court realized that the existing system was unsustainable. Hungarians respected Dék for his moderation, while Viennese officials recognized him as a reasonable and principled interlocutor. The situation became even more pressing after Austria's involvement in the conflict with Prussia. The Austro-Prussian War exposed significant military weaknesses, culminating in a decisive defeat for the Habsburgs. This loss forced the empire to confront its vulnerabilities. Without reform, Austria risked losing further influence on the European stage. Faced with external threats and internal discontent, the monarchy began to reevaluate its approach to Hungary. In this context, negotiations between Hungarian representatives and imperial officials took on new urgency. Dék and his colleagues argued that Hungary would support the empire if its constitutional rights were restored. They emphasized the importance of cooperation based on equality rather than subordination. Vienna, weakened and increasingly aware of the need for allies, became more receptive to these arguments. The culmination of these negotiations was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. This historic agreement created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, fundamentally altering the structure of the empire. Under the terms of the compromise, Hungary regained significant autonomy. It established its own government, parliament, and administrative systems. The Hungarian Diet was reconvened, and the April laws, long suppressed under neo-absolutism, were largely reinstated. At the same time, the compromise preserved the unity of the Habsburg Empire in key areas. Austria and Hungary shared a common monarch, foreign policy, military command, and certain financial obligations related to imperial defense and diplomacy. These shared institutions were managed through joint ministries, ensuring cooperation between the two halves of the dual monarchy. The agreement was not a return to the full independence many Hungarians had envisioned during the revolution, but it granted a level of self-governance unmatched since the medieval era. With the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, Hungary entered an era of profound change. The long struggle for political autonomy had finally resulted in a new constitutional framework that granted the kingdom substantial self-governance while preserving the unity of the Habsburg Empire. This arrangement created the dual monarchy, a political partnership in which Austria and Hungary functioned as two distinct states under one monarch, but shared responsibility for foreign policy, military affairs, and certain financial obligations. For Hungary, the decades following this agreement brought rapid modernization, economic transformation, social change, and the emergence of Budapest as one of Europe's great cities. The compromise reshaped political life at every level. The Hungarian Diet regained authority, now empowered to pass laws independently within the kingdom. Hungarian leaders assumed control over domestic administration, education, internal trade, and taxation. The Hungarian government was headed by its own prime minister, who oversaw ministries that managed the affairs of a modernizing state. For many Hungarians, especially the political elite, the compromise fulfilled the long-held desire to restore historic rights while enabling Hungary to operate as a modern constitutional nation. One of the most visible transformations during this era was the modernization of infrastructure. Railways expanded across the kingdom, linking remote agricultural regions with industrial centers and major markets. The government invested heavily in transportation, seeing it as essential for stimulating economic growth. New railway lines connected Budapest to Vienna, Prague, and other major European cities, integrating Hungary into continental trade networks. The increase in mobility fostered economic development, cultural exchange, and the spread of new ideas. Budapest itself became a symbol of Hungary's modernization. Formed by the unification of Buda, Pest, and Óbuda, the city experienced rapid expansion and architectural transformation. Broad boulevards, public parks, and grand buildings rose along the Danube. Inspired by Parisian urban planning and Viennese architectural styles, Budapest evolved into a thriving European metropolis. The construction of the Hungarian Parliament building, one of the largest and most ornate legislative buildings in Europe, reflected both national pride and confidence in the kingdom's future. The city's transformation showcased Hungary's ambition to present itself as a modern and prosperous nation within the dual monarchy. Economic development accelerated alongside these urban changes. Hungary's agricultural sector, long the backbone of the economy, benefited from improved transportation and new technologies. Grain production expanded, and Hungarian livestock, especially cattle and horses, became important exports. The fertile plains of the Great Hungarian Plain provided abundant resources for both domestic consumption and trade. As farming methods improved, rural communities experienced greater productivity, though disparities between wealthy landowners and poorer peasants persisted. At the same time, industrialization gained momentum. Factories emerged in Budapest and other cities, producing textiles, machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods. Mining, especially of coal and iron, contributed to industrial growth and supported the building of railways and factories. This shift from a predominantly agrarian economy to a more diversified one played a crucial role in shaping modern Hungarian society. It created new employment opportunities, attracted workers from rural areas, and fostered the emergence of an urban working class. The rise of industry and commerce contributed to the growth of a Hungarian middle class. Merchants, professionals, civil servants, and entrepreneurs gained influence in economic and cultural life. This group embraced education, innovation, and civic involvement, becoming key supporters of modernization. Schools and universities expanded, promoting scientific research, engineering, and the humanities. Hungarian intellectuals contributed to literature, mathematics, music, and the natural sciences, earning recognition across Europe. Culturally, the dual monarchy era became one of Hungary's most vibrant periods. Hungarian writers and poets explored new literary forms, blending romanticism, realism, and national themes. Composers and musicians drew on folk traditions while embracing modern styles, enriching the kingdom's cultural landscape. The National Theatre and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences played central roles in promoting artistic and intellectual life. Budapest's cafes and salons became meeting places for writers, journalists, and thinkers, discussing everything from philosophy to political reform. Yet beneath this flourishing cultural and economic development lay underlying tensions. The compromise had restored Hungarian autonomy, but it also created new responsibilities and challenges. One of the most significant tensions arose from the kingdom's diverse ethnic composition. Within Hungary lived numerous nationalities, including Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Germans, Ruthenians, and Jews, each with its own language, traditions, and cultural identity. The political elite, dominated by Hungarian-speaking nobles and urban professionals, often sought to promote Magyarization, the spread of Hungarian language and culture across the kingdom. While Magyarization policies aimed to unify the state, they also generated friction and resentment among non-Hungarian communities. Many ethnic groups felt that their languages and traditions were being marginalized in schools, administration, and public life. This discontent contributed to growing national movements among Slovaks, Romanians, and others who sought greater cultural and political recognition. The dual monarchy, composed of many nationalities, faced similar tensions across its territories. But Hungary's efforts to strengthen its national identity intensified these internal conflicts. Political life within Hungary also grew more complex. The Diet debated a wide range of issues, from economic reforms to language policies, reflecting the kingdom's dynamic and diverse society. Liberal politicians advocated modernization and civil rights, while conservatives sought to preserve traditional structures. Tensions between these groups shaped debates about land reform, voting rights, and the role of the monarchy. Although the political system allowed lively discussion, it also entrenched divisions that would resurface during times of crisis. Relations with Austria presented another set of challenges. While the dual monarchy created a partnership between the two halves of the empire, the balance of power was never entirely equal. Disputes regularly emerged over shared finances, military organization, and foreign policy. Hungarian leaders demanded a fair contribution to imperial expenses and greater influence in joint affairs, while Austrian officials often viewed Hungarian autonomy with suspicion. These disagreements required constant negotiation through the so-called delegations, representatives from Austria and Hungary who managed common affairs. Although the system functioned for decades, it required delicate compromise and often left both sides dissatisfied. As the 20th century dawned, Hungary stood at a moment of both promise and uncertainty. Within the dual monarchy, the kingdom had experienced rapid modernization, cultural flourishing, and economic growth. Budapest rivaled major European capitals, industries expanded, and intellectual life thrived. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity lay deep-rooted tensions, ethnic divisions, political disputes, and unresolved debates about Hungary's place within the empire. These internal issues, combined with gathering storms across Europe, would soon plunge Hungary into one of the most devastating periods in its history. The outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914 marked the beginning of a catastrophic series of events that would reshape not only Hungary, but much of Europe. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Hungary was automatically drawn into the conflict. Although Hungarian politicians had limited influence over imperial foreign policy, they nevertheless supported the war effort in its early stages, believing that swift action could preserve the stability and integrity of the empire. Hungarian soldiers made up a significant portion of the imperial army that marched into battle. The multi-ethnic composition of the empire meant that regiments often included Hungarians, Germans, Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and others serving side by side. Initially, many believed the war would be short, shaped by old assumptions about rapid mobilization and decisive victories. Instead, it dragged on for years, claiming countless lives and consuming the resources of the empire. The war placed immense strain on Hungarian society. Rural communities saw large numbers of young men conscripted, leaving fields untended and families struggling to maintain agricultural production. Urban centers faced shortages of food, fuel, and essential goods as the war disrupted trade networks and redirected resources to the front. Inflation soared. Wages lagged behind rising prices, and living conditions deteriorated. Women took on expanded roles in factories, hospitals, and administrative work, filling gaps left by absent men. Their contributions became essential to sustaining both the home front and the war effort. Politically, the war exposed the fragile relationship between Austria and Hungary. Hungarian leaders increasingly resented the dominance of German-speaking officials in Vienna, as well as the imperial military command's decisions, which often ignored Hungarian concerns. At the same time, debates over national rights intensified among the empire's many ethnic groups. As casualties mounted and hardships deepened, loyalty to the Habsburg Dynasty weakened across all regions. By the later stages of the war, it became clear that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could not sustain the conflict. Military defeats on multiple fronts, against Russia, Italy, and later against the Allied powers, eroded morale. Desertions increased. The empire's complex internal structure, once its strength, now became its greatest vulnerability. Nationalist movements surged, calling for independence or autonomy. The fragile dual structure of Austria-Hungary began to unravel. In Hungary, political change accelerated quickly as the war approached its end. The long-serving Prime Minister, István Tisza, who had initially supported participation in the war, lost public confidence. As defeat loomed, pressure grew for democratic reforms and an end to imperial control. By the autumn of 1918, as revolutionary movements swept across Europe, Hungary declared its separation from the Habsburg monarchy. A new government formed under the leadership of Mihály Károly, a politician who championed democratic ideals and social reform. Károly sought to distance Hungary from the empire's wartime policies, end hostilities, and establish a modern parliamentary system. His government dissolved ties to the Habsburgs, proclaimed the First Hungarian Republic, and began implementing land reforms. However, Hungary faced enormous challenges: famine, economic collapse, demobilized soldiers returning home, and the threat of foreign occupation by neighboring states seeking to claim territories where their ethnic populations lived. As the First World War ended, the victorious Allied powers gathered to redraw the borders of Europe. For Hungary, this process would become synonymous with national trauma. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire left many political and ethnic questions unresolved, and Hungary's leaders were in a weak position to influence negotiations. Károly's government hoped that democratic reforms and withdrawal from the war would earn sympathy from the Allies. Instead, the lack of strong leadership and the presence of rival claims from neighboring countries complicated Hungary's situation. International pressure and domestic instability led to the collapse of Károly's government. In its place emerged a new regime under communist leader Béla Kun, who proclaimed the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Kun promised to defend Hungary's territorial integrity and introduce radical social reforms. However, his government lasted only a few months. Internal opposition, military defeats, and occupation by Romanian forces quickly brought the experiment to an end. In the power vacuum that followed, a conservative counter-revolutionary movement formed under the leadership of Admiral Miklos Horthy. Horthy's forces entered Budapest and established a provisional government. Although Hungary now had a functioning leadership, the nation remained deeply weakened and vulnerable as the Allied powers prepared to impose a peace settlement. The Treaty of Trianon, signed in the year 1920, imposed harsh terms on Hungary. The treaty stripped the country of approximately 2/3 of its territory and redistributed these lands to neighboring states, including Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the newly formed Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Millions of ethnic Hungarians found themselves living outside the borders of the new Hungary, a loss that deeply affected national consciousness. The once expansive kingdom was reduced to a landlocked, much smaller state with limited natural resources and a profoundly altered demographic structure. The consequences of Trianon extended far beyond geography. Economically, Hungary lost vital agricultural regions, mineral-rich areas, and important railway networks. Politically, the treaty generated long-lasting resentment and a sense of injustice that shaped Hungarian foreign policy for decades. Socially, the influx of refugees from former Hungarian territories strained housing, employment, and welfare systems. The trauma of Trianon became embedded in the national psyche, influencing literature, public discourse, and political movements. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary found itself profoundly altered. The once vast kingdom had been reduced to a fraction of its former territory. Millions of ethnic Hungarians were living beyond the new borders, and the nation struggled with economic disruption, political fragmentation, and a wounded sense of identity. Into this turbulent environment stepped Admiral Miklos Horthy, a former naval officer of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who would become the central figure in Hungarian political life for more than 2 decades. Horthy's rise to power began with the collapse of the short-lived communist regime led by Béla Kun. After Romanian forces withdrew from Budapest, conservative and nationalist factions consolidated control, presenting Horthy as a stabilizing figure capable of restoring order. He entered the capital at the head of a nationalist military force and soon became the head of state. While Hungary remained a kingdom in name, it had no king, and Horthy ruled as regent with broad authority. His regime blended conservatism, nationalism, and strong executive power, aiming to rebuild the country after years of upheaval. The early years of the Horthy era focused on internal stabilization. One of the first challenges was addressing the influx of refugees from territories lost through the Treaty of Trianon. Families uprooted from their homes arrived in the truncated Hungary, seeking shelter, employment, and new livelihoods. The government established programs to support these displaced communities, but resources were limited, and economic conditions remained difficult. Inflation, unemployment, and shortages strained daily life. Politically, the Horthy regime sought to balance authoritarian control with limited parliamentary traditions. Elections were held, but the government maintained strong oversight, and opposition parties faced restrictions. Conservative landowners, military officers, and elements of the middle class formed the backbone of the regime's support. At the same time, various right-wing movements emerged, some advocating more extreme nationalist or revisionist agendas. Although Horthy did not fully embrace these radical groups, he tolerated their existence and occasionally used their popularity to strengthen his political position. Revisionism became a defining theme of interwar Hungarian politics. The loss of territory and the presence of Hungarian minorities in neighboring states created widespread resentment. Many Hungarians viewed the Treaty of Trianon not merely as a political setback, but as a profound historical injustice. Calls to revise the borders or regain lost regions echoed constantly in public discourse, education, and political debate. This sentiment influenced Hungary's foreign policy, pushing the country toward alliances that promised support for revisionist aspirations. Economically, Hungary faced the formidable task of rebuilding an independent national economy. Much of the kingdom's industrial base, natural resources, and transportation networks had been located in territories now assigned to neighboring countries. To recover, Hungary had to modernize agriculture, strengthen remaining industries, and attract foreign investment. Land reforms aimed at redistributing estates to peasants were introduced, though they often fell short of addressing deep inequalities. Gradually, with international loans and careful financial management, Hungary began to achieve relative stability. Culturally, the interwar period witnessed both continuity and revival. Hungarian intellectuals, artists, and writers grappled with the meaning of national identity in a drastically changed world. Some works expressed sorrow and nostalgia. Others sought to redefine Hungarian culture in modern terms. Universities and academies continued to promote education and research, while theaters and literary journals reflected a society searching for its place in Europe. As the 1930s progressed, Europe entered a period of increasing tension. The rise of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy dramatically altered the political landscape. Both regimes opposed the post-war settlement established by the Allied powers and signaled their willingness to challenge the borders defined by the peace treaties. For Hungary, this presented a dangerous but enticing opportunity. The authoritarian regimes of Berlin and Rome expressed sympathy for Hungarian revisionist aims, offering diplomatic support in exchange for political alignment. Horthy and many Hungarian leaders hoped that an alliance with Germany and Italy would lead to the peaceful recovery of lost territories. As a result, Hungary slowly drifted into the orbit of these powers. Economic agreements with Germany increased Hungarian exports, especially agricultural goods, strengthening the country's economy but also creating growing dependence. Diplomatic ties deepened, and Germany's influence over Hungarian foreign policy expanded. The first major territorial revision came through the First Vienna Award, in which Germany and Italy granted Hungary portions of southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia. A second revision followed, returning parts of northern Transylvania from Romania to Hungary. These territorial gains, achieved without war, were celebrated widely across the country. Crowds cheered returning Hungarian forces, and public celebrations reinforced the belief that alignment with Germany could restore historic Hungary. Yet these gains also tied Hungary closer to the Axis powers, reducing the kingdom's ability to maintain independent policy. As the Second World War erupted, Hungary found itself increasingly entangled in the conflict. Initially, Horthy attempted to maintain a cautious distance, participating minimally and avoiding direct involvement in major military campaigns. However, the pressure from Adolf Hitler and the allure of further territorial revisions proved difficult to resist. Hungary joined the Axis alliance and eventually entered the war against the Soviet Union, sending troops to the Eastern Front. The consequences were severe. Hungarian soldiers fought in harsh conditions, suffering heavy losses as the tide of war turned against the Axis. At home, the government implemented increasingly repressive policies, influenced by Nazi ideology. Anti-Jewish laws, introduced earlier in the interwar period, intensified as Hungary aligned more closely with Germany. These laws restricted employment, education, and civil rights for Hungarian Jews, paving the way for even more tragic events. Despite Hungary's alliance with Germany, Horthy and several Hungarian leaders grew increasingly uneasy about the war and sought ways to exit the conflict. Secret contacts with Allied representatives explored possibilities for a separate peace. When Germany discovered these negotiations, it responded swiftly. German forces occupied Hungary, effectively removing the kingdom's autonomy. Under occupation, a radical pro-Nazi party, the Arrow Cross, gained control, introducing brutal policies and accelerating the deportation of Hungarian Jews. The Holocaust in Hungary became one of the most tragic chapters of the war. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to concentration camps, primarily Auschwitz, in a shockingly short period. Many perished, and the cultural, social, and economic contributions of Jewish communities, vital parts of Hungarian society for centuries, were devastated. Although Horthy managed to halt some deportations toward the end of the occupation, the damage was irreversible and remains one of the darkest moments in Hungarian history. The end of the Second World War brought devastation to Hungary on a scale scarcely imaginable. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were destroyed, and countless families mourned the loss of loved ones. Yet the war's end did not bring immediate freedom or self-determination. Instead, a new era began under the shadow of Soviet occupation. This period reshaped Hungary's political, economic, and social landscape, gradually replacing the remnants of the Horthy regime with a communist state aligned closely with Moscow. The transformation was neither simple nor instantaneous. It unfolded through a combination of military presence, political maneuvering, and ideological pressure that culminated in the creation of the People's Republic of Hungary. As the Soviet Red Army advanced westward during the final stages of the war, it occupied Hungary piece by piece. The Siege of Budapest, one of the longest and most destructive urban battles in the region, left the capital nearly unrecognizable. Once the fighting stopped, the Soviets treated Hungary as a defeated Axis ally, even though many Hungarians had not supported the wartime government's alliance with Nazi Germany. The presence of Soviet troops ensured that Moscow would play a decisive role in shaping Hungary's future. In the immediate post-war period, Hungary attempted to rebuild a democratic political system. Multiple parties emerged, representing a range of ideologies. The Independent Smallholders Party gained significant support, promising land reform, reconstruction, and a break from the authoritarian practices of the past. The Social Democrats also attracted voters who sought workers' rights and social justice. Meanwhile, the Hungarian Communist Party, though relatively small at first, possessed a powerful advantage: the backing of the Soviet Union. Soviet authorities encouraged communists to take key positions within the administration, police forces, and interior ministry. Through these institutions, communist leaders gained influence disproportionate to their initial public support. Among them was Matthias Rakoczi, who would become the dominant figure in early communist Hungary. Rakoczi's tactics were strategic and relentless. He employed what he once described as salami slicing, a method of eliminating political opponents gradually, one thin slice at a time. By targeting rival parties, arresting key figures, and manipulating electoral processes, the communists steadily dismantled Hungary's fragile post-war democracy. Land reform, one of the most significant early changes, redistributed large estates to peasant families. This policy had immense symbolic and practical importance. Many rural workers, long burdened by deeply unequal land ownership, welcomed the opportunity to farm their own plot. Yet the reform also weakened traditional elites and increased communist popularity in the countryside. However, the initial promise of land ownership would soon give way to forced collectivization, a hallmark of Soviet-style agriculture. By the late 1940s, the communists had effectively consolidated power. Elections became tools of manipulation. Opposition parties were dissolved or absorbed, and independent newspapers were shuttered. The monarchy, which had existed symbolically even during the Horthy Era, was abolished. In its place, the People's Republic of Hungary was declared, aligning the country firmly with the Soviet bloc. Rakoczi, now General Secretary of the Hungarian Working People's Party, oversaw the transformation with strict ideological control. The new regime sought to reshape Hungarian society along Marxist-Leninist lines. Industry was nationalized, private enterprises were dissolved, and central planning replaced market-driven economics. Factories, mines, and transportation networks came under government control. The 5-year plan, modeled on Soviet economic programs, aimed to accelerate heavy industrialization. Steel plants, machine factories, and energy projects expanded rapidly. While these projects created jobs and modernized some sectors, they often ignored Hungary's traditional strengths in agriculture and light industry, causing inefficiencies and shortages. In everyday life, the impact of communism permeated nearly every corner of society. Schools adopted Marxist ideology, emphasizing loyalty to the state and the Soviet Union. Religious institutions faced systematic pressure. Churches were restricted, their leaders monitored or imprisoned, and religious education was curtailed. The arrest of Cardinal József Mindszenty, accused of treason and conspiracy, became a powerful symbol of the regime's hostility toward independent religious authority. For many Hungarians, these changes represented a profound loss of cultural and spiritual freedom. Political repression intensified throughout the 1940s and early 1950s. The state security services, guided by Soviet advisors, carried out arrests, interrogations, and show trials. Tens of thousands of citizens, teachers, soldiers, intellectuals, clerks, peasants, were accused of sabotage, spying, or political dissent. Many were imprisoned or deported to labor camps within Hungary and, in some cases, sent to Soviet gulags. Fear became a constant companion in daily life, as neighbors hesitated to speak openly, unsure who might report them. Collectivization marked another stage of transformation. After initially benefiting from land redistribution, rural families soon faced pressure to join collective farms. These cooperatives, designed to pool resources and standardize production, were often opposed by peasants who valued independence and distrusted centralized authority. Resistance was met with harsh penalties, including fines, loss of rights, or imprisonment. Agricultural production suffered as morale and efficiency declined. Food shortages became common, exacerbating public frustration. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, signs of resistance began to appear in various forms. Writers and artists used subtle symbolism to critique the regime. Workers participated in slowdowns or small acts of sabotage. Students discussed forbidden books or ideas. While none of these acts amounted to organized rebellion, they reflected widespread dissatisfaction. The rigid economic system and political repression created deep resentment, particularly among young people and intellectuals who remembered the relative openness of the pre-war years. The years following the Second World War had transformed Hungary into a tightly controlled communist state backed by Soviet power. Surveillance, political repression, economic hardship, and cultural restrictions created widespread frustration among ordinary citizens, students, workers, and even members of the Communist Party itself. By the mid-1950s, this dissatisfaction had reached a breaking point. What happened next? The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 became one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Cold War and a defining moment in Hungary's modern history. The revolution did not erupt suddenly. It built gradually through conversations, petitions, and small acts of defiance. Hungarian students, inspired by reform movements in Poland and dissatisfied with the rigid ideological control at home, began meeting to discuss political reforms and national sovereignty. Writers and intellectuals gathered in forums such as the Potofi Circle, where they openly criticized past abuses and demanded change. The removal of the hardline communist leader Matthias Rakoczi created hope that genuine reform might be possible. But when his replacement failed to initiate meaningful changes, the pressure increased. On an autumn day in Budapest, a peaceful student demonstration marked the beginning of a nationwide movement. What began as an organized march quickly grew into a massive gathering, as workers, university students, and bystanders joined in solidarity. The crowd called for democratic elections, withdrawal of Soviet troops, freedom of the press, and the return of Imre Nagy, a reform-minded communist, to leadership. A symbolic moment came when demonstrators toppled a towering statue of Stalin, an act that captured both the anger and the aspirations of the Hungarian people. The response from the authorities escalated the situation dramatically. When protesters approached the state radio building to broadcast their demands, security forces opened fire, killing several demonstrators. News of the incident spread rapidly, igniting outrage across Budapest and soon after, the entire country. Armed resistance formed spontaneously as civilians acquired weapons from factories, police stations, and armories. Barricades appeared in the streets, and clashes erupted between Hungarian fighters and the Soviet troops stationed in the capital. Caught between the demands of an angry populace and the pressure of the Soviet Union, the Hungarian communist leadership faced a crisis. In an effort to calm the unrest, Imre Nagy was reinstated as prime minister. His return brought a surge of hope. Nagy announced reforms that included freedom of speech, the dismantling of the secret police, and the intention to negotiate the withdrawal of Soviet forces. For a brief, extraordinary period, Hungary appeared to be carving a path toward independence and political pluralism within a socialist framework. The momentum of the revolution, however, grew faster than the leadership could manage. Workers' councils formed across the country, taking control of factories and transport systems. Political parties that had been banned since the late 1940s resurfaced. Demonstrations filled the streets, calling for full sovereignty and an end to one-party rule. Nagy, responding to the demands of the revolutionaries, declared Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and announced its status as a neutral country. This bold move directly challenged the Soviet Union and raised fears in Moscow that Hungary could inspire similar uprisings elsewhere in Eastern Europe. The Soviet leadership, unwilling to risk a collapse of control within its sphere of influence, made a fateful decision. After initially indicating a willingness to negotiate, they launched a second, far more forceful intervention. Soviet tanks and troops poured into Hungary in overwhelming numbers, targeting key positions in Budapest and other cities. The fighting was fierce and courageous, but the imbalance of power was insurmountable. Hungarian resistance fighters, many of them students, factory workers, and ordinary citizens, fought street by street, using rifles, Molotov cocktails, and makeshift barricades. Despite their bravery, the revolution was crushed within days. The aftermath was painful and traumatic. Thousands died, and many more were wounded. Hundreds of thousands fled the country, seeking refuge in Austria and beyond. Imre Nagy, who had sought asylum in the Yugoslav embassy and later was arrested, would eventually be executed after a secret trial, an act that made him a martyr in Hungarian memory. The Soviet Union installed a new government led by János Kádár, a communist official who had initially sided with the revolution, but later aligned himself with Moscow's demand for stability. Kádár's position was precarious. He faced widespread resentment from a population that viewed him as a traitor, yet he also had to convince the Soviet Union that he could maintain control. His early years in power were marked by harsh reprisals. Thousands were arrested, many were sentenced to prison or labor camps, and a number of revolutionaries were executed. The goal was clear: to eradicate any possibility of renewed rebellion. Over time, however, Kádár adopted a more pragmatic approach to governance. Recognizing that constant repression would only deepen resentment, he gradually introduced policies aimed at improving living standards and reducing ideological rigidity. This approach became known informally as Goulash Communism, a system that blended elements of socialism with limited market mechanisms and a more relaxed cultural environment. The name reflected the mixture of ingredients, economic, social, and political, that defined this unique form of Hungarian communism. One of the hallmarks of Kadar's system was the emphasis on consumer welfare. While ideological loyalty remained important, the government sought to gain legitimacy by improving everyday life. Housing projects expanded, wages increased gradually, and a wider range of consumer goods became available. Workers enjoyed more stability, and small private enterprises, such as family-run shops or workshops, were tolerated within certain limits. This mixed economic model set Hungary apart from stricter communist regimes in the region. Collective farms, once imposed harshly, were reorganized to allow more autonomy for local communities. Farmers were permitted to cultivate small private plots, sell produce at local markets, and retain some profits. This semi-private agricultural model proved surprisingly effective, making Hungary one of the more prosperous food producers in the Eastern Bloc. Cultural life also experienced cautious liberalization. While censorship remained, artists, writers, and filmmakers were allowed to explore themes with greater nuance than in earlier years. Hungarian cinema, literature, and music gained recognition for their creativity and depth. Intellectuals who had once been suppressed found space to work, though still within boundaries set by the state. The regime adopted an unofficial motto: "Those who are not against us are with us," signaling a shift away from the rigid ideological intolerance of the Rakoczi era. Internationally, Kadar sought to improve Hungary's reputation. Though firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, Hungary became known as one of the more open countries in the Eastern Bloc. Trade expanded with Western Europe, and tourism increased, bringing foreign currency and cultural exchange. These developments contributed to a sense of cautious optimism among many Hungarians, who, despite knowing the limitations of the system, recognized that life had become less harsh than under earlier communist rule. By the late 1980s, the seemingly stable structure of Goulash communism had begun to show clear signs of strain. For decades, Hungary had balanced limited economic freedoms with tight political control, offering a comparatively softer form of socialism than many of its Eastern Bloc neighbors. But beneath this surface, the combined pressures of economic stagnation, rising foreign debt, and shifting international dynamics created cracks that would eventually transform Hungary entirely. What followed was a peaceful but profound transition from a one-party socialist state to a democratic republic integrated into Western political and economic frameworks. The first major challenge was economic. Throughout the 1970s, Hungary had borrowed heavily from Western banks to finance consumer goods, infrastructure, and improvements in living standards. While this strategy allowed Hungarians to enjoy a higher quality of life than many other communist countries, it built an unsustainable financial foundation. By the late 1980s, repayment obligations grew difficult to meet, factories struggled to remain productive, agricultural output slowed, and inflation rose. Citizens began to feel the tightening conditions, questioning whether the current system could deliver a better future. Meanwhile, political change was sweeping through the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. These reforms encouraged openness, economic restructuring, and indirectly, greater political pluralism across the Eastern Bloc. Though not intended to dismantle communist regimes entirely, they created new space for criticism, debate, and experimentation. Hungary became one of the first nations to seize this opportunity. Reform-minded politicians within the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party began advocating for changes that went beyond the limited adjustments of earlier decades. A key figure in this period was Prime Minister Miklós Nemeth, who recognized the urgent need for economic reform and political liberalization. Under his leadership, discussions began on transitioning toward a market economy, reducing state control and engaging with Western institutions. These internal reforms were accompanied by growing pressure from civil society. Independent organizations, opposition groups, and intellectual circles gained momentum, voicing demands for free elections, freedom of expression, and an end to single-party rule. One symbolic turning point came when Hungary decided to remove sections of its heavily fortified border with Austria. This decision was not merely administrative. It signaled a willingness to soften the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe since the early Cold War. When East German citizens, seeking a route to the west, began gathering in Hungary, the government faced an international test. Ultimately, Hungary allowed them to cross into Austria, contributing to the chain of events that would soon lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall. This humanitarian gesture revealed how far Hungary had moved from its earlier role as a loyal Soviet ally. As public discussion expanded, the ruling party engaged in formal negotiations with emerging opposition groups. These discussions, known as the Round Table Talks, addressed crucial questions about constitutional reform, the role of political parties, and the framework for free elections. Participants included representatives from various reform movements, including the Hungarian Democratic Forum, the Alliance of Free Democrats, and other emerging parties. Although these groups differed ideologically, they shared a commitment to dismantling the one-party system through legal, peaceful means. In this changing environment, one historical issue resurfaced with powerful symbolic force: the legacy of Imre Nagy, the reformist leader executed after the 1956 uprising. Many Hungarians viewed Nagy as a martyr for national sovereignty and democratic socialism. His name had long been suppressed, but as censorship weakened, calls grew to rehabilitate him officially. In a dramatic moment of national reconciliation, Nagy's body was reburied with full honors in a public ceremony that drew massive crowds. This act symbolized a break from the past and a collective acknowledgement of the injustices committed under earlier regimes. Political transformation accelerated rapidly. The constitution underwent revisions to eliminate the communist system, remove ideological language, and re-establish core democratic principles, including separation of powers, rule of law, and protection of civil liberties. By the end of 1989, Hungary declared itself a republic once more, adopting the name Republic of Hungary. The red star, a symbol of communist rule, was removed from public buildings, and preparations began for the first free elections since before the Second World War. These elections, held the following year, brought a peaceful transfer of power from the Communist Party to newly elected democratic leaders. The Hungarian Democratic Forum emerged as the most influential party, forming a coalition government committed to guiding the nation through the transition from socialism to capitalism. The goals were ambitious: privatizing state industries, modernizing economic structures, encouraging foreign investment, and building institutions that could sustain a democratic political culture. The shift to a market economy, however, brought challenges. State-owned factories closed or downsized, leading to unemployment and social uncertainty. Inflation rose, and many Hungarians faced economic hardship. Despite these difficulties, there was widespread recognition that these reforms were necessary to achieve long-term growth and integration with Western Europe. The transition demanded resilience, patience, and a willingness to accept short-term hardship for long-term benefit. In foreign policy, Hungary sought to redefine its place in the world. With the collapse of the Soviet bloc, Hungary oriented itself toward Euro-Atlantic institutions, seeking partnerships that would secure political stability and economic opportunity. Diplomatic efforts focused on joining the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This new direction reflected a desire not only for strategic alignment, but also for belonging to a democratic community that valued human rights, open markets, and freedom of movement. Hungary's accession to NATO marked one of the major milestones of the post-communist era. By joining this alliance, Hungary reaffirmed its commitment to collective security and cemented its ties with Western nations. Shortly afterward, Hungary completed the complex process of meeting the requirements for European Union membership, reforming laws, modernizing industries, and demonstrating adherence to democratic principles. Entry into the European Union symbolized Hungary's return to the European mainstream after decades of isolation behind the Iron Curtain. These achievements, however, did not mean the end of political debate within Hungary. Questions about national identity, economic inequality, and the meaning of sovereignty resurfaced in the new democratic landscape. Some citizens felt that globalization threatened traditional values, while others believed that integration into Europe was essential for progress. Competing visions emerged, reflecting the diversity of perspectives in a society undergoing rapid transformation. Throughout the early 21st century, Hungary experienced continued economic development as well as political shifts. Debates about constitutional reform, media freedom, and European integration intensified. The country's leaders, across multiple governments, emphasized different priorities, from strengthening national identity to deepening ties with European partners. These dynamics shaped public discourse, influencing how Hungarians viewed both their past and their future. Despite these debates, the long-term trajectory was unmistakable. Hungary had transformed from a Soviet satellite state into a democratic nation playing an active role in European affairs. The journey had been marked by courage, struggle, compromise, and adaptation. The memories of earlier eras, the medieval kingdom, Ottoman rule, the fight for independence, the traumas of world wars, the tragedy of 1956, remained woven into the national narrative, informing contemporary choices and aspirations. Hungary's post-communist journey did not erase the complexity of its history. Rather, it added a new chapter that demonstrated the nation's capacity for renewal. The fall of communism had brought both challenges and opportunities, ultimately enabling Hungary to define its own path in a rapidly changing world. With this final section, we conclude the chronological arc of Hungarian history up to the modern era, a story of resilience, reinvention, and enduring identity across more than a millennium of change.